それでは皆様大変長らくお待たせいたしました。
So thank you very much for waiting. Now this is time to start with Japan-US dialogue, how we can manage and bring solution to threats from North Korea. And this program is co-organized or hosted by Genro NPO and Luz Foundation. And to begin with our forum, Yasushi Kudo, who's the president of Genro NPO, will start off. Please come and please start off. Mr. Kudo. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for joining us here. Friday last week, when we had the meeting with full party talks with the Japan, US, South Korea, and China, Genro NPO was very busy because we need to evaluate the results of general election. That was, but we kindly come to finish that work. So we wanted to get started back again with the North Korean discussion. Now, Mr. Trump is coming to Japan, China, and South Korea. Chinese National Congress is being completed. Now, given this time, isn't there anything that civil societies like ourselves can contribute? Non-government, there's only so much non-government can do, but starting discussion about what we can do and share those voices with the people at large is our objective. But we do not want to simply discuss for the sake of discussion. We want to bring something specific, like starting the process of peace-building framework for this region. We do have an organization committee for that, and our Japan-US conference is the practical launch of our specific activities. We've been doing discussions with China for the last 13 years. We did that with South Korea too. But Japan-US alliance is essential in bringing peace in this region. And we want to combine different programs, finally coming together with Japan-US conference so that we can bring multilateral civil society or non-government-based discussion dialogue platform. And a Japan-US conference shouldn't be focused on discussion for the sake of discussion. We should be focused on bringing solution for North Korean issue, because without solving North Korean issue, there's no end in terms of successfully bringing in peace in this region. But we need to share this passion together with not only with Japan and the US, but also with China and South Korea in terms of the processes or the goals of what we can do. And I'd like to propose two specific goals that I'd like to share. And it's not only me talking. This is the results of discussions with Miyamoto-san and others in Genro NPO. That one is we would not recognize or accept nuclear North Korea. But we do not rely on use of force in bringing that option together. And is those two unknown, this equation easy? It's not easy. It's going to be a very long journey, most likely. But we are here to discuss, hopefully to bring in answers to those two specific questions. We are going to be having a long afternoon today, but please join until the very end, and we'll be open to questions. Should you have any questions, please ready. You jot down your question toward the very end. Thank you again. And welcome. Well, thank you very much, and I'd like to now invite now for the peace building program. Genro NPO started this platform. It's a Japan that is the Asia Peace Building Framework Project, and former Ambassador Miyamoto is leading that project. I'd like to invite him to speak next. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Northeast Asia has been coming to very dramatic developments when the Senkaku issue brought out confrontations, so to speak, in Japan and China. That happened. And North Korean nuclear challenge is something that we have seen where North Koreans been taking a step-by-step approach in maturing their nuclear technology. Given that as the background, can we bring mid to longer range safety and a peaceful framework in this region which we lack today? Or shouldn't we at least start our discussions in Japan as well as with our friends overseas? And that led to the Peace Preparation Committee in our organization. And the key to that cause is Japan and US. We should be giving discussions so that we can, as much as possible, come into alignment to each other and be able to share the same common values and goals with probably most significant asset in this region. For North Korea, we have piles and piles of problems in North Korea, and we learned firsthand how difficult it might be to bring solutions to this problem. And that difficulty being felt and experienced over decades for us. But the fact that this problem is complicated is now suddenly right in front of our face. So the problem is a very difficult one. Is that going to end up being another war? Or is there any escape option from the war? A non-war option, or do we need to do that? Have to recognize North Korea as a nuclear state. If it is the nuclear power recognized as, then what would be the strategic options do we have? And what are the different choices that we need to make? I hope I have demonstrated this unknown in Japan has suddenly became specific and urgent security challenge to us. And for you in this room to start thinking about it is also value by itself in having Japan-US conference. As an organizer, representing this organizer, I'd like to give that as the words to open up and encourage you to come think about it. And Ambassador Miyamoto, thank you very much. I'd like to now get started with the discussions for our Japan-US conference. I'd like to first introduce the panelists. We have experts from security, diplomats, and the defense experts are here. Total of 10 experts. We are here. I'd like to introduce panelists from America who traveled all the way from America to Japan, starting from the center. First, James Schaff, who's the Asia Senior Associate in the Asia Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Next to him is Douglas Pearl, Vice President for Studies, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Next to him is a former United States Ambassador to the Republic of Korea. Ambassador Mark Lippert is here with us. Next to him is a senior fellow at Heritage Foundation. Bruce Klinkner is also with us. Next to him is from Johns Hopkins, Assistant Director, U.S. Korean Institute. Johnny Town is here with us. And lastly but not least, next to him is Director of Opinion Poll Ghibli Telhami is here with us, who is from University of Maryland. And we have our panelists from Japan too, who I would like to introduce to you next. From the middle center is the former ambassador to China, who is also chairman of Miyamoto Institute of Asian Research. We have Yuji Miyamoto here with us. Next to him is former Vice Minister of Defense, Minister Masanori Nishi is here with us. Next to him is former Commander-in-Chief Maritime Self-Defense Fleet, Yoji Koda. Commander Koda is with us. Next to him is former Vice Minister of Defense for International Affairs, Hideki Tokuchi is here with us. And Yasushi Kudo, President of Gendo NPO, will be chairing and facilitating these panels. And with that, Kudo-san, please take the panels from here point on. Now we will start our discussions. Then my mic on? Yes, you can hear me? All right. Now today we have two specific sessions in this today's program. First, I will ask 5 panels to talk about highlighting the issues challenges that we are facing, and we are having partners with Maryland University to better understand the opinion of the people about this issue. If we are ready, we wanted to share the results of the opinions, but we didn't have enough time to put the results made ready. But we decided to have another survey to Gendo NPO's members, a quick survey, which I think the results are distributed to you, and this gives quite insight. One of the things is a lot of people agree that more than 50% of the people thought it's a very difficult issue, North Korean issues are, but haven't really given up the problem. Well, first off, 70% of the people responded said we do not recognize or do not accept North Korea as the nuclear power, and but also without use of force. But that is very difficult ones to achieve, and there are 2 trends that we can read from here. One is the deterrence, nuclear deterrence. We need to have better deterrence in Japan. Slightly, that idea is, for example, introduce American nuclear to Japanese land. 45.6% agree that we can do so. This is not the general public opinion poll, but there are about 20% of the people responded said that Japan should now have a nuclear power. We have a nuclearized state. But because of uncertainty, Japan should also have a deterrent power, apparently. But it's less than 50%, let's say. It's minority. Yes, there is a sign of concern, but there are more stronger opinions amongst these experts who responded to bring solutions to this problem. We don't know what solution that might be, but according to the survey, multilateral dialogue or discussions is that's what a lot of people expect to be one of the solutions. Japan, US should be the key to that. But whether identifying agenda, exit strategy, or crisis management, we need to discuss many different things about it multilaterally, and getting support from multilateral government, the people. We cannot completely draw that as a conclusion, but that is the one significant trend that we saw in this survey. We are still in the process of researching whether general public agree with that. But earlier, Chairman Miyamoto has just said, to bring this solution, we need to start discussion, having a bigger discussions in identifying scenario between the two countries, Japan and America. We believe that's very important. That's why we invited for Americans, first off, American friends, to start talking about how they see as the challenges that we face in combination with the one person from Japan. And we can maybe start off from here. Douglas Park from Carnegie, Vice President of Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Please, can you start off, please?
Konnichiwa minasan. It's very nice to be with you all here this afternoon. We've got a very distinguished panel of Japanese and American experts together, and to kick it off, I thought I would just do a broad framing of the world and the Asia-Pacific region as I see it. We could bear down very quickly on things that are happening today. At the end of this week, President Trump will make his first trip, beginning an important trip to Asia. In China, they just completed the 19th Party Congress and finished the consolidation of power for their leader, Xi Jinping. On the Korean Peninsula, we have at any time the potential for another intercontinental ballistic missile to be launched. The approaching capacity of matching nuclear weapons with delivery systems is a source of great concern. And not even far away, we have to be concerned about the shifts that are taking place in the world. In the Middle East, as ISIS is coming to its end in Syria and Iraq, the traditional conflict between the Turks and the Persians and the Arabs may reemerge. So the world is full of challenges and threats. I would characterize it as the world is in disarray. The unipolar world we had from the end of the Soviet Union until a few years ago is also gone. We are now experiencing a return to major power rivalry globally, whether it's Russia or Europe or China and the United States. And the U.S. dominance is not what it was. In your neighborhood, here around Japan, you're facing the transition from a period when the United States held dominant position right up to the mainland of Asia, and now China has been putting forth capabilities and adventures to challenge that. And how we manage that challenge may be the critical issue for the next decade or two. In the period of 5 years before Xi Jinping took power, through his first 5 years in office, I think the number is right, China has built 239 ocean-going vessels and continues to build them at a rapid pace. So the United States Navy, the Japanese Navy, the Chinese Navy are going to be bumping into each other in ways that we need to be confident will not lead to new conflicts. The great power disarray means that we can't easily count on each other for cooperation. If you're trying to deal with the North Korean problem, increasingly Russia, which has a weak international position economically, but retains military capabilities and geographical reach, is in a position to interfere with the sanctions and the efforts of the international community to press North Korea into cooperation on their nuclear weapons and missile capabilities. So it's a much more disorderly world, and we need to bring in my view, new concepts for how we manage it. We probably will have to look back to the 19th century when we last had major balance of power challenges for global leaders. China is growing in power and importance in this part of the world, and yet it has 14 neighbors along its land border, 3 marine neighbors as well. No one of those countries wants to be an ally of China. All of those countries want to profit from trade and investment with China. None of them really wants to be an ally of the United States either, necessarily, if that brings them trouble with China. So we need to find a way to create balances of power with China that allow us to work with, but when necessary, to concentrate power to oppose aggressive impulses or misbehavior, whether commercial, financial, or military, by China in this region. This is not the way we've been thinking for the last 50, 60 years. So we have to stretch our brains, come up with new concepts, and seize the opportunities. I do think this is a period of opportunity. Xi Jinping is now very strong in China. He's not as held back by party interests. Your leadership here in Japan has got a new lease on life for the next few years. We have relatively new leadership in Washington, and if we can pull ourselves together, we too can be part of this dialogue over how to move ahead. India is coming out of its long time shell. So powers are at work, opportunities are there, and I'm going to stop with that. We can return to these themes later in the question and answer period.
Thank you very much. Next, I would like to invite Mark Lippert, the former U.S. ambassador to the ROK, please.
Thanks for the introduction, and it's great to be here. Real honor to be on this panel with so many distinguished experts, including colleagues that I worked with closely when I was in the Pentagon, counterparts in the Ministry of National Defense here, so it's good to have a little bit of a reunion. I guess what I'll do is maybe, since my last job after I left the Pentagon was to be the ambassador to South Korea, I might talk a little bit about the North Korean situation more narrowly, and of course happy to get in to where things get into more detail in the back and forth in the questions and answers. What I would say first on North Korea is that you cannot run a strong North Korea policy without a strong alliance between the United States and Seoul. And also, I think what is incredibly helpful is obviously to try to get that alliance to work well with the U.S.-Japan alliance and really get into a trilateral posture that does a couple of things, shows solidarity, but also puts pressure on Pyongyang to do more. So that's point one. Point two is, how is the alliance right now between Washington and Seoul? I would say that despite potential structural problems between a liberal government and a right-of-center government in Washington, liberal government in Seoul, North Korea policy is generally aligned. There is general agreement that the way forward is a pressure strategy aimed at Pyongyang, aimed at getting the North Koreans back to the negotiating table. And I was just in Seoul not too long ago, and I think they do feel that they generally have alignment. The long pole in the tent, obviously, it was that there was some uncertainty thrown into this from some of the president's comments about that diplomacy should not be exercised at the point in time. But you've seen Secretary Mattis this weekend try to clarify the policy and essentially say, yes, in fact, we are running a pressure strategy aimed at Pyongyang, the goal being to get the North Koreans back to the table. But having said that, there is work to be done. The relationship between Washington and Seoul is always one that is filled with excitement and adventure. And so I think how the general work of alliance management in the coming days in terms of the trip, but more importantly, weeks and months after the president comes and goes from the region, is something that is critically important to how we fare on North Korea policy writ large. Let me just quickly pivot to North Korea itself and just say that just a couple of points. First, on Kim Jong-Un himself, he is not his father. He is much more black and white than his father was. I think he's much more reckless in many respects. I think he's in control of the country, and I think he's rational. He does not want to come back to the negotiating table, at least at this point, and he is rejected in treaties from almost every member, in fact every other member of the six-party talks to get into a sustained dialogue in some way, shape, or form. Think back 2015, South Korea proposed inter-Korean talks. Those were eventually rejected. This new government, the Moon Jae-in, put forward humanitarian and military talks. Those were rejected. The U.S. has reached out many times. So the list goes on, but the data show, and they point in one direction, that Kim Jong-un isn't interested in negotiations, at least at this point in time. I think he is driving hard towards the goal, at least in the short term, of a nuclear-tipped ICBM, perhaps a second strike capability, working to make that, putting that capability perhaps on a road mobile system to make it harder to find and more survivable. And I do think that the jury is out on his intentions and his understanding of the strategic landscape around him. The point I always make is, on the one hand, I think you can argue that he senses weakness in the international community and is just driving towards a nuclear-tipped ICBM unless and until the international system can stop him. On the other hand, there have been multiple opportunities to engage in negotiations or split the international community by, for example, accepting President Putin's invitation to come to Moscow in 2015. He declined that. That would have put pressure on the Chinese. He could have engaged in inter-Korean talks. He could have accepted the U.S. In treaties along the way. That probably would have caused a bit more friction and less unity among the other members of the six-party talks and in the international community writ large. Let me just wrap up by saying it's unclear also what his final destination is. I tend to put it in three buckets. Bucket one is that he just drives on and goes for a really big program, right? Looks like Pakistan. And there's always been historical links between the North Koreans and Pakistan. And there's also some evidence to suggest that the North Koreans, well, not evidence to suggest, the North Koreans have often said that they want to be like Pakistan, or recognized as your nuclear power. Second is he could get to a certain level, nuclear-tipped ICBM, could keep going, or he could slow down at that point, but then there's the danger of coercion. I think we're all worried about that, right? That's sort of outcome two. And outcome three is probably the most optimistic, is he gets to the nuclear-tipped ICBM threshold or somewhere around, and he turns into the economy. He does have issues with market activity that he probably has to deal with. He does want to run the economy more like his grandfather, with a more active role. And there's no doubt that because the state has not been involved in the economy over the last 30 some odd years, that the state's control over the country has weakened. To close, the U.S. essentially has three basic options. First is containment. The second is what the current policy seems to be, which is pressure to negotiate. And the third is strikes or more covert options. So I think those are really the three big buckets. And I think that, one of the reasons that there's so much interest in trying to get the North Koreans back to the table is that it is the shortest distance to an agreement that is also peaceful. But it also keeps you out of a very binary situation between contain and strike. And I think that's also another point of emphasis. So the president has a lot of work to do on his trip out here in the region. Like Doug, writ large, I sense not just challenge but opportunity, and call me an eternal optimist. But the stakes could not be higher, because this is the flight deck of the world's economy. It's over the last half century, the growth here has been unprecedented. But there's also, moreover, you see the reach of the cultural reach and all the other pieces that make this part of the world so important to the larger international order. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. So next, now someone who's very knowledgeable about North Korea, right? From Jenny Town from Northwestern University. Where are we with respect to North Korea? I would like to invite her to say a few words.
Great, thank you. And thank you to Genran for inviting me here today. I would agree with a lot of what Douglas Paul was saying earlier in terms of sort of this new concept and rethinking balance of power and this idea of great power disarray. And in that, I would sort of pose a couple of challenges to maybe a couple of things that Ambassador Lippert has said. In terms of, I think we do need to rethink what we're actually trying to accomplish with North Korea and how we're approaching that, and if we're on the right path. Is a strong position really the right position forward, right policy going forward? And what is that really based on? And I think we have to be realistic about things in saying that, we are beyond the point of trying to prevent North Korea from getting nuclear weapons and nuclear technology. They already have it. And so going forward, there's really no easy answers. There's no easy paths. There's no easy solutions. And there's no guarantees in any kind of diplomatic effort. They have been testing ICBMs. They've clearly captured now also American imagination as to really being able to, Americans really now internalizing the threat, much as what South Korea and Japan have been for decades. And I think this is really driving, the president to take this threat as a, more urgent threat than what we have in the past. And I think he's really sort of staked his reputation now on trying to solve this issue. But if we look at North Korea in terms of how we're approaching them and how they respond to things, if you look at the conditions inside North Korea, this is not the same North Korea that we approached, in the 1990s during the agreed framework. So North Korea now is much stronger economically. They've made clear advancements in their nuclear technology and missile technologies. So they feel stronger, they're technically stronger, and now in the past couple of years, even though there have been attempts at negotiations, if you look at the strategic environment, that from North Korea's perspective, it's very difficult for them to take advantage of, to agree to some of the terms of engagement that have been offered to them. Especially over the past few years when you had Park Geun-hye in South Korea calling for South Korean-led unification efforts, when you had the human rights community targeting Kim Jong-un directly through the Commission of Inquiry, holding him accountable for crimes against humanity and campaigns to take him to the International Criminal Court, when they've expanded the US-ROK joint military exercises to include decapitation drills and strategic assets and strategic overflights. North Korea's been looking at this and watching all of these signs, and instead of being able to intimidate North Korea, the North Korean reaction to this is one to lash back with provocations. And so this has been kind of, the problem is that we've really kind of been pushing each other to further escalate the situation. A lot of the military posturing and a lot of the attempts to intimidate North Korea have actually forced them to make decisions that tend to lean towards more and more provocations. And so a lot of this tough talk, and now especially with President Trump and his tweets and the fire and fury and his attacking of Kim Jong-un personally, even though Rocket Man doesn't seem like it's such an insult, it is still Kim Jong-un takes this very personally, and it is, again, something that forces him to respond and forces him to respond in provocative ways. So I think, when we think about how we're approaching this situation, and if we want this to first de-escalate the situation in order to be able to have the more constructive, more constructive dialogues on, security issues. I think we have to understand that how North Korea is receiving these signals, and acknowledge that the nature of the regime, they do feel strong now, and one is that they don't believe they have to make concessions in order to get to negotiations. And so I think a lot of the attempts in the past that have come from the international community for negotiations have been very specifically about denuclearization. And the North Koreans really look at this as, why would we agree to an endpoint before we get to the table? And how can we instead get to the table to negotiate about security issues that can include discussions of nuclear weapons and the path forward, but without it, but the optics matter of how do we, as much as the U.S. wants to have and the U.S. and allies want to have a strong position in this, North Korea also does not want to look weak, and I think we have to understand that. And the idea that, there's been now this push towards a pressure campaign, and we need to pressure North Korea to negotiate. And one, it's based on the premise that North Korea doesn't want to negotiate. And in discussions that I've had with North Korean officials, this isn't necessarily true. There is a desire to negotiate. They're not going to beg for negotiations, but they have specific terms that they want negotiations on as well. And so far, it isn't that they don't want to negotiate, it's that we haven't found a common understanding of what those terms of engagement should be. But two, the idea that you can intimidate North Korea, again, their first reaction is usually to lash back instead of to be scared. So, and even if they are scared, they're going to lash back even bigger in order to prevent something, prevent any type of military actions or any further actions to harm their state. The other idea is, even if you cut them off economically, and a lot of people talk about, well, if China just cut them off, North Korea would collapse, and that's not necessarily true. North Korea has more options than just China. And so at some point, you have to worry that if we cut them off too much, isolate them too much, have too many sanctions, kick them out of the international financial systems, for instance, we're actually pushing them further underground and pushing them further towards more rogue actors and more, potentially non-state actors, where if they do get desperate and they do want money, hard currency, sources of hard currency, they do have options, and those are options that we don't want them to take. The other reality is that, North Korea is a state that knows suffering. Economic contraction is not going to collapse the state, and we've seen this in the past, is that they're very good at adapting, but they're also very good at suffering, at shouldering this, again, at the cost of the people. But in a campaign like this, when you're exuding so much pressure and you're isolating them from the international community, and it's damaging, it's hurting the everyday lives of the people, it becomes a much easier argument for the North Korean government to really pose this to the people as well, is that the reason for your suffering now is the US and the campaign against North Korea rather than mismanagement of North Korea policy. And I would just kind of close by saying, the more we pressure them without a real strategy on what it takes to get back to negotiations and how we can have a more constructive dialogue and de-escalate, the more we're actually pushing them further back into the policy that it was under Kim Jong-il, of this Song-gun policy, military first, rather than encouraging the Byungjin policy, the economic portion of the Byungjin policy, and really trying to encourage the further marketization and opening of North Korean society. And so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very, very much. Last but not least, from Maryland University, Professor Telhami is here with us. And there has been a lot of opinion polls conducted by Professor Telhami. I would like for Mr. Telhami to share with us what's the current status of American public opinions about this issue.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real honor for me to be here and to join this impressive panel. I would like to talk more about public opinion in America toward the Korean issue and Japanese-U.S. relations. And in that regard, I would say that we are pleased and honored to cooperate with Genron NPO. We're both conducting polls as we speak. I'm carrying out a poll in the United States about North Korea and U.S.-Japanese relations, and Genron NPO is conducting a poll here in Japan. We're asking some of the same questions, and we should have the results released perhaps late November. In the meanwhile, what I did was I pulled a few slides from previous polls that I've conducted and also from other polls that have been conducted in the U.S., and in some cases comparing them with other countries. Here I'd like to say that I will show you how divided the American public is at the moment on many issues. To be sure, the American public is united also on many issues, including defending allies and certainly showing resolve before in front of threats. And this has always been the case. It still is the case. And you'll see that despite the division, Americans remain united on things that are important, including that are important for Japan. But we really can't understand where the public is and what the results mean unless we understand how deeply divided Americans are on some core issues of the day. And I'm going to start by giving you two examples of that partisan divide. The first example is this question that was conducted by Quinnipiac University just recently in October. And it's, do you have confidence in President Trump to handle the situation with North Korea? And if you look at the red, that is Republicans, the blue is Democrats. And you can see what we have here. 83% of Republicans say yes, and 93% of Democrats say no. And yes, overall, more Americans say no than yes, but still you can see how big this divide is on this issue. The same thing in a poll that I conducted last spring on the so-called travel ban that the president put in place for people from some Muslim majority countries. And you look at 88% of Republicans support the ban, 86% of Democrats oppose the ban. Independents are exactly divided right in the middle, and America is right in the middle. Look at the black, that is total Americans, almost exactly 50-50. So that is kind of a representation in some ways of where we are on many issues. And it's not really just the presidency. I mean, I know President Trump has been unusual. This is an unusual presidency. But it is also reflective of something, I think, a little bit deeper than Mr. Trump himself or the presidency of Mr. Trump. Now, one of the questions that we have asked, and some of those we're asking now as well, this is from a poll, again, last spring, when we ask a question about who do you believe is America's biggest foe today? And by the way, this is an open-ended question. So we don't lead them, we don't give them choices. They can write any name they want. And you can see here, yes, North Korea is number one. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But again, look a little bit at the divide across party lines. So for Russia is almost tied with North Korea. 26% of all Americans, the black line, if you look at the black line on top, say in North Korea, 24% say Russia. If you look at the red lines, certainly Republicans have North Korea by far ahead, but Democrats have Russia as a bigger foe than North Korea. They have, if you look at the numbers across the board, there are some important differences between Democrats and Republicans, even on this issue. And here I would also like to add, while North Korea has certainly emerged as a top priority issue, as you see here, just a few months before that, in the middle of the U.S. elections in the fall, I did another poll, and when you ask what is the number one issue, the number one issue was ISIS. The so-called Islamic State, by far number one. North Korea was not near the top. And so you have to remember that that was part of also the presidential campaign, the rhetoric, the cues that presidential candidates put into the field. And even before ISIS appears to be on its way out in Syria and Iraq, this was taken already in April, where the rhetoric was focused more on North Korea. So the degree to which the public is focused on one issue or the other is certainly partly true, dependent on what happens on the ground, but it's also very much dependent on what American presidents and leaders highlight in their discourse. And you could see that here as well. Now, here's another interesting question that we ask: whom among world leaders do you dislike most? We also have who you like most. And this, again, is just as to look at cues to see what people think. And we use that as a way of thinking what's on their mind rather than it's a real popularity contest. Now, I want you to look again here to see, this is an open-ended question, Democrats and Republicans. So Democrats by far name President Trump as the most disliked leader. You could tell that is, again, an indication of where we are in partisan politics. Republicans name Kim Jong-Un as number one by far. But if you look down below, Republicans more Republicans name Barack Obama than Bashar Assad or Vladimir Putin. So again, this is kind of a little bit of a sampling of the divide that we're now facing in the United States. Nonetheless, I want you to look at this important poll from last spring done by Pew. And this has to do with things over which Americans really come together. So when you look at the 65% of Americans, not surprisingly, are very concerned about North Korea. But when you ask if an Asian ally got into a serious conflict with North Korea, U.S. should use force to defend them, you have almost 2/3 of Americans say yes, the U.S. should use force to defend Asian allies if they come under threat. So that's an interesting one. The use of military force, there's been a change in the American public over the North Korean issue. This is from Gallup comparing data from 2003 to 2017. So in 2003, only 47% said they would back military action against North Korea, quote, if peaceful means fail. 2017, the same exact wording of the question, you have 58% of the American people say they would back military action, significant increase. Now, I have to say to you, I don't ask questions like that because I'm not sure what if peaceful means fail. What does that mean? Over what? Fail to do what? To get what? It's not very clear. But nonetheless, since the same question was asked, it tells you that the American public has become, in principle, more open to using force. Here's an additional indicator of that. Do you think the situation involving North Korea can be successfully resolved using only economic and diplomatic efforts or not? Now, what successfully resolved mean, of course, is not indicated. Doesn't mean, so what is a successful resolution to the issue? But nonetheless, again, comparing 2003 to 2017, what you find is in 2003, 72% said that the conflict could be successfully resolved using only economic and diplomatic means. In 2017, Americans are divided almost 50-50 on this issue. Slightly more people think yes, but 45%, say no. So there's, again, what I call this a slippery slope of expectations, because what we have is when you start failing year after year to get what it is that you put as an aim, even if it's a vague aim, and you don't get there, people start looking at the next possible escalation, even if it's military. And that is why I think, that's one risk in the sanctions, is that if they don't obtain whatever the objectives are, then you have that risk. By the way, here's a comparative study that Pew did across nations about which is better option for dealing with North Korea. Is it increasing economic sanctions, or is it deepening ties with North Korea? And you find that Japan and the U.S. are almost identical. 61% say increase sanctions, just about a quarter say deepening ties, and this contrasts with countries like the Philippines and Vietnam, where people think that engagement is better. Just a couple of more slides I want to show, and then I'll end. Do you think it is more important to avoid war with North Korea, or do you think it is more important to take away North Korea's nuclear weapons? Okay, so that's a choice. Obviously, a lot of people see that as a stark choice, but it's out there. And here you find, again, huge differences across party lines. Overall, a slight majority of Americans think we should avoid war. That's more important than taking away North Korea's nuclear weapons, 52% to 41% overall. The black, if you look at the black line, that's what that is, the majority of Americans. But when you look at it by party, while 69% of Democrats say we should avoid war, 63% of Republicans say we should take away North Korea's nuclear weapons. So again, a huge difference in our politics. By the way, in the confidence in President Trump, there's been no change whatsoever over the past few weeks in this crisis. Roughly 57, 56, 54, 56% say they don't have confidence. He gets about 40% confidence on this particular issue. Just to end, generally speaking, how much do you think this is comparing the Japanese and the Americans on this issue, whether they have a trust on the other side? So the question in the United States was, how much trust do you have in, should the U.S. have in Japan? And then in Japan, how much trust do you think Japan could have in the U.S.? It's very, very similar, actually. I know that you look at the red bar and the gray bar, one is a great deal, one is a fair amount. If you combine them together, you get roughly 70, 75, 78, depending on 68% in the United States. You get 75% in Japan. But that's actually quite a bit of trust. That is actually, maybe you can argue that this is one of the, it's been there for some time, but clearly there's a benefit to the relationship that comes out of North Korea. And I think there's quite a strong opportunity for improving the relationship. Do you consider the countries listed below to be a friend or a foe of the United States? And you could see here, again, Japan, 73% of Americans think Japan is a friend. If you compare this, with China, only 38% say it's a friend. Even with Germany, more people think Japan is a friend than Germany, 68%, slightly behind Canada, 83%. I'll end with that.
Well, thank you very much. Now, with that, I'd like to invite our Japanese friends. We are humble people in general, so we decided to only pick one. But Nishi-san, please pick up some of the discussions that went on earlier and talk Japanese perspective. Well, thank you. North Korean nuclear and missile issue has surfaced at the early 1990s. So what quarter century has been passed since we have been very much living together with this problem for us. At the very beginning, Nobara Ishio, who's the head of the cabinet, Joint Cabinet Secretary, was Japan cannot do anything, even if American forces needs to make something. And he was very disappointed. He made that comment. Over the last 23, 25 years, Japanese side saw quite a change, some of the legislation changes, with the adjustment in coordinating with the U.S., particularly in 2015 when the U.S.-American guidelines have been revised. The peace security agreement have been pushed forward. So this bilateral relations have changed so much, quite a bit. But the years, 25 years that is enough time for North Korea to develop and mature their technology to for whether nuclear or missile. So 25 years is given to great advantage for the North. But before the perfection or getting ready for the nuclear and missiles, we don't have much time left for their completion. But that may change the seawater Meaning, if the North wants to have additional round of better, more advanced technology, that will require them to spend long time. And while we are accelerating the sanctions to the North, when the UN resolution was reached, one of the things that was very unique is the U.S. have shown one of the goals of the security of the sanctions. And of course, because of the negotiation nature, some of the compromise may be made, particularly for Russia and China. But the goal have been discussed and shown. And the U.S. can unilaterally can take some sanction actions to reach that goal. And China is pressured to tighten its financial control, which developments we haven't seen so much. So the time advantage is now the ball might be slightly shifted to our court. Of course, things will not move so easily. And in the next, let's say, 1 year or so, the North, whether it's for nuclear or missile, when they are perfecting the technologies, while for the time being, this 1 year or maybe less is the opportune time where we can take action without feeling threat from specific strike from the North. But after that time is passed, then we are talking about different phase. And now, more recently, Russia's deepened its relationship with North Korea, which is completely a new dynamic as well. Now, the problem is amongst this dynamism, what Japan's been preparing, baby step at a time, but the situation seems to be becoming dire and dire. But what will be our next steps? Maybe isn't this time to redefine our grand design because of the changing nature of the dynamics? Nuclear is something that we cannot accept, needless to say, for Japan's perspective. And missiles with the range of Japanese land is already developed for some times. Now, ICBM threat from the U.S., the same significance is felt already to Japan, but the significance will change, ranging, including in the U.S. Now, next 1 year, and the time value might be different from Japan and the U.S. Another part is China, something that may not known so widely. Recently, the media started to talk about it also. That is, China and North Korea are not really friendly to each other. Or for China, it was a heavy weight on their shoulders. Historically, North Korea has been. Now, with this understanding widely spread, at the same time, relying only in China about sanctions will only go so far. Maybe we can move to the next phase with dealing or partnershiping with China in North Korean problem. For Russia, like I said, 6 parties discussions, 5 parties discussion, excluding the North. Russia is the important part of it. So we are about to getting into new dimensions. And the time that we are left with is 6 months or 1 year at the most. In that time, we have to clarify and review and discuss what would be our new direction moving forward. And this discussion shouldn't be only closed within governments. Track 2 or this kind of platform is very useful. But in any case, the timing is very tight. The core is the Japan and the U.S. relationship. So starting to discuss so that we can, as much as possible, align to each other is something that is critically important, colossally important. Well, thank you very much. Now we went through presenters sharing their how they see their issues, and we are right on time, 1 hour. I am a bit scared that we are not behind the time. Now, yes, we went through the presentation, but I just wanted to have questions to our American friends. And please raise your hands if you want to, our Japanese friends, if you want to ask other questions. Now, Paul-san and Bruce Klingel-san, who didn't from Heritage, who didn't present, two questions to two of you. America, America has a agreed goal to denuclearize North Korea? If so, what are potential scenarios that are possible? And use of force. And also there are some degree of acceptance from the people's opinions, right? But how should I perceive that use of force, right? And two of you can hopefully will respond, and anybody else, if anybody wants to also respond. Paul-san, would you please go first?
Actually, I'm going to let Bruce go first because he hasn't had a chance to speak yet. Thank you.
All right. Hopefully I didn't just... There we go. To put it perhaps in a bit of context, we've heard, in some of the slides and outside commentary of, we need to begin dialogue and engagement, as if we haven't been trying that for a number of years. And just to sort of look back, we've had 4 international agreements where North Korea promised never to build nuclear weapons, 4 subsequent agreements to give up, promising to give up what they promised never to build in the first place. We've had 2-party, 3-party, 4-party, 6-party talks. I guess we could try a different number of chairs around the table. We've had 25 years of official and unofficial dialogue, and if you talk to government officials or former government officials, they'll say, we tried even without preconditions and offered talks without preconditions. North Korea has turned off the New York channel only to reopen it to allow the return of the comatose and dying Otto Warmbier. South Korea has also tried. They have 240 agreements with North Korea, obviously not all nuclear. They failed to induce political and economic reform or moderate Pyongyang's behavior. Also, the U.S. and South Korea and others have offered or delivered massive amounts of economic benefits. South Korea, $7 to $9 billion. Others have been provided or promised. And oftentimes these are dismissed as hardline conditions, as if they wouldn't be offered without North Korea cutting up its last nuclear weapon. But of course, the conditions were North Korea to begin to abide by its many previous commitments. So what is the North Korean message now? That they will not denuclearize. Now, how do we know that? Well, because they've said it by Kim Jong-Un, the North Korean Constitution, the Foreign Minister, the Central Military Commission, the National Defense Commission, the General Staff of the Korea People's Army. The list goes on and on and on. Every senior entity of the North Korean government has said they won't denuclearize. Now, some have had a conditionality of, well, they might denuclearize if the U.S. abandons its hostile policy. Now, what does that mean? Well, they seem to have a varying definition of that. They don't want to be pinned down. But some of the things that they've offered as definitions of the U.S. hostile policy over the years that they would require us to abandon would be our defense treaties with Japan and South Korea, the presence of U.S. forces Korea and U.S. forces Japan, our extended deterrent guarantee, or the nuclear umbrella. Also economically, all UN sanctions, all U.S. sanctions, which, by the way, are U.S. law. Societal, even no more criticism of the North Korean regime, which inconveniently includes the constitutionally protected rights of freedom of assembly and expression. So what does the U.S. want? Well, we would like North Korea to abide by the UN resolutions, 10 or 11 of them, international law, U.S. law. We'd like them to stop counterfeiting our currency, stop producing and trafficking illegal narcotics. The largest source of methamphetamines, illegal meth in Japan, is from the North Korean regime. Stop committing crimes against humanity, et cetera, et cetera. So basically obey the law and resolutions. Now, right now, the mood in Washington is on pressure. You have, according to the U.S. Congress, at a time when the two parties can't seem to agree on anything, you have votes of increased pressure on North Korea by votes of things like 98-0 in the U.S. Senate and 419-1 in the U.S. House of Representatives. Obviously, very overwhelming bipartisan support for increasing pressure on North Korea to try to bring about a change in their calculus on maintaining nuclear weapons, as well as to fulfill other objectives, which I can get into during subsequent discussion.
And I'll add to what Bruce has just said by noting I was involved in the very first round of American discussions with North Korea in 1991, and we attempted to establish our good faith at that time by withdrawing tactical nuclear weapons from the Korean Peninsula and from the region, so that that would not be an obstacle to get talks going. And we suspended the Team Spirit large-scale military joint exercise with American and South Korean troops as another way of removing obstacles to talks. And here we are 25 years later, and we're no closer to an agreement. This, without going through all the details as Bruce has just done, it leaves us with a recognition that the likely outcome is going to be one not of resolving the problem on the Korean Peninsula of the nuclear capabilities, but of how to deter it and how to contain it. Now, there may be some scope for negotiations, as we had with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, where both sides at some point determine they have enough to deter the other side, that they can reach a common agreement on not going farther. And that may give us some ability to talk to North Korea about when are enough weapons enough. We also will never, I believe, come to the point where we accept their right or their nuclear status, which is going to complicate any such negotiation to determine what are our ceilings on their behavior. So I think this is a problem we're going to deal with for the long term. That's why at the outset of my remarks today, I talked about the big picture. In the United States today, and maybe here in Tokyo, I'm not so sure, there's a lot of faith that somehow China is the key to getting North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. And if only we could get China to enforce the sanctions well enough that North Korea will become more cooperative. I don't share that view. I think China is a very important part of any effort to deal with North Korea. Without China's help, the situation will not get better or will not stabilize. But I don't think China is sufficient by itself to solve this problem. China is a part of a solution or a part of a management, let's say like a treatment. Here in Asia, you have a history that's different from Americans. Americans tend to think of problems as solvable, whereas often in Asia, you're going to be near an unpleasant neighbor for a long, long time. And the question is, how do you manage the neighbor, not how do you solve the problem? And I think that mindset needs to pervade our own thinking as we go forward. How do we manage the North Korean problem for a very long term? And in that respect, I think China can play an important role. And that's why I think this is a time when statesmen can come forward with concepts of management that can be presented to the Chinese leadership, which is newly consolidated. Here in Japan, where you have more stability than you've had in a long time in the leadership of the country, and elsewhere in the region, to see if we can find some conceptual breakthroughs to allow us to contain the damage that potentially could come from North Korea. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you all and to collaborate with Genran NPO on this program. Kudo-san, you asked about the use of force and that issue in the United States. And I think that is still actually a very early debate going on in the United States right now. Despite the press reports about these issues or Trump's Twitter account, it's a very real debate that has begun, but it's still relatively new. And as Doug Paul has just talked about, this idea that this could be a very long-term management issue North Korean nuclear capability. Some are beginning to argue that as bad as a potential war could be on the Korean Peninsula, if we use some kind of military force to stop this program, the worst option is to have a highly sophisticated nuclear-capable North Korea that could put at risk multiple U.S. cities of attack by nuclear weapons. So the idea that sooner is better than later if we have to deal with this problem through some kind of military means. The counter argument to that, which is rooted in our experience with the Soviet Union and with some other countries, is that nuclear threats can be deterred, that if Kim Jong-un clearly understands that any nuclear use would mean the relatively immediate destruction, complete destruction of his country, that in itself would be a limiting behavior on North Korea. Why would he build hundreds of nuclear weapons if he knew he could only use one? Why would he use one if he knew that it would destroy his country? And at a personal level, I tend to be convinced that containment and deterrence is possible and that is a preferred option. But it is a reasonable argument that's being made that Kim Jong-un might not be the same kind of leader, or that regime may not be behave the same as the Soviet Union or China or some other countries did, and that 20 years from now, the threat could be so potentially catastrophic that truly then we would not intervene in some kind of lower level conflict involving North Korea, that in fact it could change our behavior in terms of how we deal with North Korea. So I think it's still a very early debate. I'm not, Trump's tweets, I think there's some kind of, he believes that helps his negotiators a little bit. So some of this is not bluffing, but it is, I don't think we're quite in as dangerous or imminent of a threat of American military use in terms of a preventive type of strike. Although I do think if North Korea acts in a bold way or shoots a missile at Guam or in a more intimidating way, the U.S., I think now, the Trump administration is certainly interested in finding a way to demonstrate our stronger resolve and power. So in reaction to something that North Korea would do, I do think there is an increased chance of some kind of activity. So there is this long-term containment management, risk management challenge that we face as a region, but then we also have this kind of short-term preventing miscalculation and trying to make sure we don't stumble into some kind of conflict.
Well, in order for the Japanese side to participate in this war, well, Jenny Town, well, you are also the editor of 38 North. You're a managing editor. As I listened to what you said, the sanctions and other things are not really effective, and we have to move toward a genuine purpose, target, goal. What should be done against the North Korea? That was not very clear. So could you clarify this point? Jenny Town.
Again, there's no easy answer to that question because it is a very difficult situation, and North Korea is more empowered now than it has been in past years. It does feel more justified now in its programs because it can point to active threats and threats, especially from President Trump. And it does see a lot of even the campaign now to increase pressure, the way that it's been sort of messaged to the public and the diplomacy that's been done for other countries to get on board with this and help isolate North Korea and help increase sanctions. By the North Koreans, they're interpreting this and other people's participation in this as part of a U.S. campaign, not necessarily as universal condemnation of what they're doing. So I think my point was really is that the more we approach this situation as we must look strong, we must, with a lot of military posturing, trying to intimidate North Korea, trying to isolate North Korea, it's actually counterproductive to what we want from North Korea. And I would sort of, yes, there have been negotiations in the past, yes, there have been agreements in the past, but no, it has not been a sustained effort over time. There's been some negotiation, some agreement, things happen, and those agreements fall apart. So the idea that we've had 25 years of negotiations is somewhat true, somewhat not true. There's a lot of dynamics within that that's sort of lost in that message. That, you know, if you look at, for instance, the Iran deal, it did take 12 years to negotiate, 12 years of sustained negotiations that had ups and downs along the way. That's not what we've had with North Korea. And yes, there's been different formats and different times, but usually, even within those formats, there's often been times where an agreement was made and the next day, actions were taken against North Korea as well that sort of led to the collapse of those agreements as well. So I think, you know, if we really want to change the nature of the conversation, you know, all of the previous negotiation efforts have really been with the Kim Jong-il regime. And Kim Jong-un we have not necessarily had a real diplomatic negotiation with Kim Jong-un from start to finish to really understand how he reacts to different things. And so far, a lot of what we've done, again, has been really focused on we have to start the dialogue. It has to be framed as a dialogue about denuclearization. And the North Koreans have really, you know, have said in non-government channels, and I have to say I've never worked for government, and I understand there's different dynamics in messaging from government to government versus non-government, but that they are open to negotiations. But again, they also don't want to look weak. They don't want to look like they can get bullied. So the more that we try and push them to a destination before they get to the table is actually buying them more time to continue developing their programs, because they're not going to agree to the optics that make them look weak. But they are willing to negotiate, but it's a matter of getting to the table and getting those negotiations started. And it's not going to be easy, especially because they are empowered in that process. But what are our alternatives at this point? Are we really ready to accept them as a nuclear weapon state, which, you know, the majority of, I think, the international community says no? Are we really ready for war? And I think, again, the majority of the international community is not ready for that either. So I think we have to be realistic about our options. And, you know, before we write off North Korea as not willing to do anything, I think we really need to test that theory first.
So now that we have heard what the Americans had to say, I would like to, perhaps questions, or I would like to solicit the views from Japan. What should we do? Miyamoto-san seems to be willing. No? Perhaps, well, he looked that way, Miyamoto-san. I wasn't so willing to talk, but well, this is indeed a very difficult crossroads that we are standing at. The speakers from the U.S. Communicate this point. We feel this very keenly. No matter what effort we make, the North Korea is not ready to accept that, receive that. So against this backdrop, how should we, what sort of approaches do we have to embrace North Korea? Again, it's very limited, and President Trump says he's going to increase the sanctions, and he's testing North. However, to me, the international community have not exhausted all the options. However, very difficult options are ahead of us, and there's no doubt about this, because the international community have to be united. Otherwise, pressure against North would not work. If we are not united, the moment we look disunited, then we will face the divisive approach by North, and the international community's pressure will weaken. And there will be time, and the end result would be North Korea would be a genuine nuclear state. That's the reality that we are faced with, and this is an extremely difficult situation that we are at. So, in my view, in this connection, I have a question to our American friends. Well, I actually have a question to Jenny Town. If this is the case, then the international community, would have no other option to accept that the North is going to be a nuclear power. Is that the only option we have? Jenny Town, right, briefly, please, to this question. Could you answer that question?
I would say no. Again, in track 2 discussions that we've had, there is still a sense that a long-term principle can be agreed upon of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, but it would take a lot to get there. And the reality is North Korea is on some level still willing to agree to a long-term principle, but not necessarily, that's not where a negotiation is going to start in terms of practical measures, because there's going to have to be a lot of things along the way to build up to any type of relationship anymore, because the relations have gotten so bad, and to create the kind of political environment it would take in order for that decision to be made, and in order to have a more robust discussion about that. But I don't think the U.S. should give up, or the international community should give up on the concept of trying to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. But again, the negotiations, in order to start the negotiations, the framing of the negotiation matters, in terms of you can have negotiations about mutual security interests that also include discussion of nuclear issues without framing it as a negotiation specifically about nuclear issues.
Right. So from the Japanese side, Admiral Koda, you're not sleeping, are you? You're awake? Yes, please. There are several points I would like to make. First, in order for us to deter North nuclearization, I think that is certainly a goal, but why is North not abandoning the nuclear development? The U.S. wants to deter North.
The North Korea wants to deter U.S. And what I believe is correct is that if North Korea has ICBM reaching the U.S., then the North Korea will be capable of deterring U.S. Then if it happens, it sounds extreme, but just for instance, North Korean ground forces eat very little, 1,000 kilocalories per day, and they have 5% body fat. So they are very, very tired. But if they try to go beyond 38 parallel to go southward, North Korea having a deterrence capability against the U.S., can we really stop them to go down south? And if for any reason North Korea wants to strike Japan, having an ICBM and nuclear capabilities deterring U.S., then if North Korea can effectively deter U.S., once again it sounds extreme, but as an example, then U.S., South Korea, and Japan-US security treaties will be neutralized in the reality. Such situation, can we accept it? I don't personally want to accept. I think we should not accept it. Japan-US security agreement and arrangement is not only for the narrow sense of North Korea, but also within the protection range of the Pacific is being supported underpinned by a U.S.-Japan security arrangement. But with the 10 ICBM from North Korea and the 10 nuclear warheads held by North Korea, if that is totally deterred, it's not acceptable at all. I was told that I was asleep, but I was really awake, and I'm so upset and angry. And what is worse is the following. Being complacent with this situation, the right-wing people in Japan would like to do a spontaneous militarization. 20% of Japanese people said that. And the opponents are saying that we should just leave U.S.-Japan security alliance. Neither is option for Japan. If I would say that I'm asleep, I have no position, but I still have 1 minute to talk. So what I would like to say is that as all our U.S. friends around this table said, they are right. For Japan-US and from the viewpoint of global strategies and including India and the Pacific and the Asian region, if we let North Korea deter U.S. with their nuclear capability, that damage would be so huge. So we should not accept it. The answer is clear, is visible. So pressure for negotiation, I think it's right. It's good. However, we also simultaneously have to think about should it doesn't function. If it does not function, the power of the pressure for negotiation doesn't work to deter North Korea. And if we should we accept North Korea deter U.S. with their nuclear capabilities and ICBM, or if they don't accept to come to the table of negotiation as a last resort, well, U.S. has a will to take action. And Japan will have as one of the options for Japan to support U.S. on a military front. I think it's still taboo to mention it in Japan for as a Japanese option. When I make such a statement on TV, it's always neglected. But we need to consider that. We have to consider it in our consideration, include that in our consideration. Well, we have the reasons to improve North Korea, but North Korea has a lot of reason to improve for their interest in the U.S. I have 0 minutes left for me for my statement now, so I stop here now. Well, right. Well, we have already started discussing about the topic of the next section. Mr. Tokuchi, would you like to make a comment? Well, thank you very much. Many people have already made various points. I have very little to add. However, I just would like to make some of the footnote to what Mr. Koda had just said. U.S. The U.S. deterrence of expansion, how much can we trust it is a question. And this question is re-emerging once again. But thinking deeply about it, the answer, this question has already been answered because by our winning the Cold War, that question has already been answered. I think we should think that way, although you may think that it's a little bit optimistic. But why am I saying so? Because even during the days of Cold War, did we, Japan or US, know fully about the USSR strategies? We cannot say 100% yes. SDI discussion of the 80s during the time of Reagan administration, back then, did the U.S. accurately understand the Soviet strategy? I don't think that answer is 100% yes. But the deterrence by U.S. of expansion was being tested at that time, and it worked, actually. It functioned, and it was successful. That's the reason why we finally won the Cold War. So basically speaking, even if we haven't understood fully what's North Korean strategy, basically we should think that U.S. deterrence against expansion is functioning and will be working. So maybe 1% of deterrence against expansion is uncertainty, because a deterrence of expansion is also a matter of psychology. But basically it is working. I think we should think that way. At the beginning of the session, Ambassador Lippert mentioned 3 different options for U.S. These 3 options, I believe, are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And we won the Cold War, and with the same logic, containment is the right strategy that we should apply to North Korea, in my view. And at least in the intellectuals community, well, Professor Akiyama is here, and Professor Akiyama's group recommendation goes in that direction, and Shuho, Scott Kagan, all saying the same in their meetings and papers. Basically, the containment policy took by George Kennan should be applied here. Being patient, vigilant, as well as firm containment is what we need to apply, in my view. That is my opinion. And one more point, in terms of role of China, effectively, when we apply the containment policy to North Korea, that will be really the framework of North Korea versus the rest of international community. Well, I have 0 minutes left, but I just would like to make one point. Chinese cooperation for our containment of North Korea will be a must. However, democratic regime and versus dictatorship, that's a framework. But China is not on the side of democracy. China, Russia, North Korea, they are all in a similar regime of dictatorship, authoritarian regime. So thinking about the international community as a whole, of course, we should request China to cooperate with us. However, rather than requesting China to cooperate with us, I think we should emphasize more on the enhancement of deterrence with the U.S. At the center. Well, thank you very much. We are now already in the very core of our discussion. So what will be the options considering the U.S. actions, and is what we are talking about. I basically talk about a system of equation, deterring military actions while we try to remove nuclear weapons from North Korea. Is it simultaneously compatible? That is why I would like to further discuss on. Now I would like to give the floor to Ambassador Miyamoto about that point. Well, about China, there are a lot of reluctance that we are hearing around this table as to whether or not we can obtain a cooperation from China. Ambassador Miyamoto, how do you think about it? Well, a while ago, I think It was in the first session, so I didn't talk much about my own opinions. But if North Korea becomes a nuclear power, and if Japan as a nation has to face with that, if such a situation becomes a reality, then that will be a fundamentally different from the past. It will be really complex and will be tough situation for Japan, I think. That means that we will be facing the threatening by North Korea with the means of their nuclear weapons. How to face it? They will not actually utilize nuclear weapons. They will threaten us with the nuclear weapons that they will hold. So we will have to be able to face with that, properly deal with that. If we just are under their threat, the discussion would be that Japan should also has nuclear weapons. Then the international community's order will just collapse as a whole. Because if we are forced to be in such an environment, from a strategic viewpoint, I think Japan, the right option is to pursue thoroughly the possibility of removing North Korean nuclear weapons, as long as there is the smallest chance for that to remain. And when it is totally eliminated, then we should think about other options. That should be in some corner of our mind. But I think we should pursue the possibility of removing nuclear weapons from North Korea. And it takes aligned actions of the international community as a whole. Based on our experiences of six-party talk, we can say that if we are not united as an international community fully, then North Korea will mobilize different means to divide us. Then our international community will become weaker and weaker. So how the international community unity can be secured is really essential, and it's really vital, increasingly vital for us. It is not simple, it is not easy, because for every nation, their own national interest is the most important, and it's at the core agenda. That's universal. But we have to come up with this unity of international community. Otherwise, any sanction against North Korea or any action against North Korea will be meaningful enough. So that leads me to talk about sanctions. In my view, sanctions against North Korea are now being conducted at the very long last in a full-fledged manner. Don't you think so? Because so far, imposing proper sanctions and North Korean reacting to that properly, it has not been the case. That's the reason why North Korea has been doing this or that action. Of course, even if economic sanctions were perfect, then North Korea wouldn't just obey. But so far, the sanctions was not conducted in such a way that North Korea was affected enough. So, but now it is at the borderline, and the North Korea administration of the North Korean people are now really starting feeling that they are damaged by their sanctions. So I think it's effective to now to enhance further the sanctions against North Korea. We should have the big picture that Ambassador Lippert mentioned. We have to have a big picture as an international community within which the North Korea is properly and accurately positioned, so that we can react and cope with that and deal with that in a correct manner. On time. Thank you very much. Ambassador Miyamoto's comment that we have just heard is the very basis of Genro NPO's thoughts, thinkings. And Mr. Koda mentioned going in the same direction. In order not to accept North Korean nuclear action, there are a lot of options. There are still a lot of things we can possibly do, I think, as well. And there can be a lot of things asking for Chinese to cooperate with us, enhancing Japan-US alliance. And I would like to ask to someone from the US side, Mr. Shock, should I address who? This question? Parson? So, Mr. Powell, because you are very knowledgeable about China.
The phrase that has not been spoken that I've heard this afternoon is regime change. How do we deal with a regime led by Kim Jong-Un that has the prospect, all things being equal, of being the same for 35 years or more under a young leader? This cannot be a comfortable prospect for the Chinese, certainly not for us. I spoke in very general terms about conceptual breakthroughs and taking advantage of the strong leaders. If I were to write the script for the moment now, maybe for the moment of the last month or two and going forward, it would be a serious discussion between a well-informed United States president who has consulted with allies in Seoul and Tokyo, who would then proceed to talk to the Chinese leadership. And in China, you can't talk up from the bottom up to the top. You have to talk at the top and then work down. So there has to be president-to-president conversation about how do we get to a better situation and how do we remove this regime while respecting the equities that each of our big powers have in the region. And it seems to me that there are assurances that could be made. For example, already Secretary Tillerson has talked about his 3 no's, one of which was the United States had no intention of taking advantage of the situation on the Korean Peninsula to place American troops in the northern part of the peninsula. This was intended to tell the Chinese that we're not trying to be a strategic or security threat by taking advantage of some change in North Korea to China's unique disadvantage. We also have to discuss contingencies. What happens if our successful sanctions bring about important change? Where does the change come from? You know, my understanding is that the Air Force, ground, and Navy commanders in North Korea are starving for budgets and equipment. It all goes to the rocket force and to the nuclear engineers. They must be looking for a moment to get their way back. There could be splits within that leadership. You know, killing off the leaders one after another to maintain the control of Kim Jong-un has bound to create tensions that could be exploited. China has been unwilling to go so far as to threaten the regime. They've made stability the part of the 2 principles they have for the Korean Peninsula, the other one being denuclearization. And up to now, when faced with a choice between the 2, China has defaulted to stability every time. I think this policy is running out, and the Chinese themselves increasingly show signs of being impatient with this. I'm sure many of you have seen an increased publication of articles by respected Chinese foreign policy thinkers who say that they've got their policy upside down on the Korean Peninsula. They're putting pressure on South Korea and enabling North Korea, and it should be the other way around to suit Chinese own interests. Well, I think the presidents need to have that conversation. What are your concerns? What are my concerns? How can we meet those concerns? And that kind of management of a potential crisis and avoidance of a crisis, hopefully, would be part of the overall picture of the United States and China learning to manage the power transition that is going to take place for the next several decades in the Asia-Pacific region. And Japanese leaders and Korean leaders should be very much part of that discussion as well. Thank you.
As Paul-san just pointed out, this power transition happening with the big picture, with that dynamics, we need to have more and more discussions. And as Paul-san just pointed out, China, well, Miyamoto-san, you are an expert in China. You are one of the very best one. Now, in Chinese, recently we are seeing many different Chinese scholars and researchers proposing or sharing different ideas about China being a little more proactive or more deeply engaged in North Korea. So there are that discussions. But the fact that there are those opinions out there, how should we interpret that particular fact? And can you talk from your perspective on that fact? Well, so far in China, if you look at their North Korean policy, conventionally is the product of compromises of different school of thoughts, whether stabilization, denuclearization, peace, whatever that might be, and they are all in one basket with compromise after compromise. So many different things inside, but as Paul Sanchez said, it's becoming a little more clearer that China is now rising as a big power. It needs to protect its own national interest. It started to show that democratic diplomatic actions, and that's one of the reasons why they are the voices of having more engagement in North Korea. And the heads of the committee, the professor at a Beijing University, Jia Kinzhao, have written this paper about North Koreans, Korean Peninsula's, if there is a military conflict, what would be our action? China needs to start discussion with South Korea and China immediately. We need to start, and that publication was done not only in Chinese but also the English, time to before wars in North Korea. What if, how to maintain order after that? What would be the process in which to be elected or be chosen, the new administration there? And it is time China needs to start having those discussions with Americans. Now, China has to take actions or discuss anticipating that worst. But having said that, it's not like we need to depend on China, right? I'm not saying that everybody in the audience, right? But if China have started to change, why not take advantage or drive that change as the diplomatic actions from West? Well, we had a chance to discuss in the morning, and most of our American friends have read this paper that you just mentioned. But having said that, how much trust can you give to China is another question. But this North Korean issue is, it needs to be multilateral. Do you think is it too much to ask to work multilaterally for this North Korean problem, engaging China to be more effective in terms of the impact of North Korea? Should we expect, or are we too naive to expect that? And if Mark Lippert-san, can you react on this discussion?
Sure. No, thanks for the question. On the multilateral front, I would say, it has to contain an element of multilateralism. How much, how deep, how broad, how big the group is, I think, an open question. I'd say that's the first point. The second point is, under the Obama administration, and I think the Trump administration is the same way. If there was a way to get the North Koreans back to the table, I think people would be much less focused on the format. And much less focused on the format, much more focused on the basis for talks and the negotiations themselves. I think, the six-party talks have now not met in years. You can question whether or not that should go forward as kind of the format. But I do think that if there was flexibility, if there was the prospect of negotiations, I think that there would be flexibility on the actual format. The only other thing I would say is that, if certain countries were not included, you'd have to do deep consultations with those countries going forward. But I do think at this point, just the reading of the room is that people would rather have a discussion and negotiation in order to get closer towards an off-ramp or substantive negotiations aimed at freezing, rolling back, and eventually getting to zero, than worry about the precise format. So I'll stop there.
Just to add to that a little bit, and building from Doug's comment, I think part of what Doug described as this sit-down and conversation between the U.S. president and Xi Jinping is kind of an ideal starting point. That if you could really have a meeting of the minds or an agreement on a broad strategy at that point, that would make everything else so much easier. But of course, famously, Obama kind of tried to have his big meeting with Xi Jinping in Sunnylands in California, and we had the Mar-a-Lago summit between Trump and Xi Jinping, and I think ultimately it's relatively clear that we will not. It's hard to imagine that we will meet that ideal or be able to start from that starting point. So in a way, in my mind, the multilateral piece becomes almost the default, or the way you have to try to manage that tension between the U.S.-China relationship, which will be exacerbated and made worse by the fact that we will take various defensive measures to build up missile defenses, to build up our deterrence capability, as has been discussed, and that those steps we will take will inevitably make China less comfortable or more suspicious of our intentions in this great game. So that doesn't mean we have to give up, and it means it will be very difficult. But in my mind, that comes back to the alliance importance, both the U.S.-Japan alliance and the U.S.-Korea alliance, but also the trilateral cooperation, because that becomes then the core of a multilateral framework that at least gives you a chance. And if you can get some better relationships between South Korea and China, if Japan can improve its relationship with China, this gives you other avenues for improving that, or developing some sort of collective agreement in terms of how to manage this pressure and dialogue dimension.
Can I just add one quick point? I would just say, before you go talk to the Chinese, I think you absolutely have to have alignment with your allies. You cannot have a situation where, quite frankly, we had in the agreed framework where certain allies were left out of the room. So I think it almost starts with alliances getting on the two key alliances in Northeast Asia, getting on the same sheet of music, then taking that sheet of music to the Chinese, so on and so forth.
Well, yes, Goro-san, please. Now, responding to the importance of a key alliance is very important. That relationship with our neighbor alliance is more difficult than dealing with North Korea, maybe, but we need to do that, I guess, right? But the difficulty that comes with the multilateralism is 6 parties discussions will favorably be taken by international society. In Japan too, we have done a lot with the 6 parties, but in 1974 to 6, where the North Korean problem became bigger. And what we Americans are afraid of was maybe deal moving forward without China. There are a lot of things that failed to deliver in 6 parties, but there are a lot of things that got delivered. Chinese perspective, from Chinese interest, national interest, America and North Korea coming to agreement without excluding China, and North Korea starts to develop something completely, new regime that is different, not friendly to North Korea. That's what Chinese are most afraid of, right? And to do so, China becoming chairman with multilateral, and everything has to go through me, China. We'll control everything. That's another side to it, right? And this possibility have slowed down, and that's why, and the Sixth Party itself has slowed down. So there's no implication from that directly today. But what my point is, China has its own interest about this problem, right? That's what I wanted to highlight. Now, Chinese role is important. We need to engage China, but we shouldn't be naive to expect overly optimistic about it, because it's not going to be panacea for everything. We think we have to understand that. And at the same time, both Americans and Japanese don't think, China, you are too slow. You are not doing anything. You have to move. You have to keep moving. But then China has its own national interest. China cannot do so much. For example, September 11 resolution from the United Nations is a compromises, but we come to resolution, right? But can we execute them, right? Just recently, I went to have a military-to-military discussion with Chinese colleagues, and then Chinese colleagues say something like this. Textile or other products are problematic because there are a lot of Chinese businesses and they will be dried up. They are commercial interest and they will. That's another side to Chinese interest, right? Sea products and textile products for them who are surviving or who are putting food on the table. The nuclear in North Korea is a lesser priority for them in stabilizing Chinese society. How much can they do? Stop textile, stop oil, stop supply of sea products. Yes, we can talk about them, but there are that reality in China. There's a huge resistance inside domestically in China. My point, I guess, is over optimism to China is too naive. We need to have a good, positive understanding of the national interest of China to understand how much China can do. If China cannot do more than this, A or B, then how can we do with rest, non-China players like America or Japan? Like we keep pressuring in vain to China. Pressuring, pushing, or just feeling the sense of disappointment about China, and nothing moves in the end. That could potentially happen.
This is the last point. But I heard the ring. Since March last year, there has been 5 UN sanctions, resolutions. What has changed as a result of these 5 resolutions? Nothing, right? That's the reality. Thank you. Well, I think in half an hour, I think if you have any further questions, we're going to collect the questions from 3 or 4:20, and I would like to invite Bruce Klingler. I would like to have your opinion, but I would like the U.S. people to be aware of this and then refer to this. Now, Miyamoto-san earlier on said, I think that's everything. Well, unless we recognize, if there is an opportunity for us to recognize North Korea as a nuclear state, if there's a possibility, we have to think about it. Well, the goal is safe. Unless we continue to pressure North, that's the idea of the Japanese side, and that's that goal. If the other countries pursue the same goal, then I think that's something that we can have a good discussion around. And so I have asked this question a number of times, but bear this in mind as you say what you have to say. Now, I would like to invite Bruce Klingler, please.
You've asked the question a number of times, and I'm actually not going to answer it. Because I wanted to get back to something that was brought up earlier by one of the panelists, and it was how much can we trust the U.S. deterrence? And I must admit, as an American, I take a little bit of umbrage at that, and I can get a bit passionate about it. Not because it was asked once during this panel, but it's a topic I hear frequently during my visits, particularly to South Korea. Can we trust the Americans? Will you be there for us? And I point out that, and often you hear it as, will we trade Los Angeles for Seoul? I point out that we were willing to take a very high number of casualties in a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union, in essence, willing to risk New York, Washington, and Los Angeles for Bonn, Paris, and London. But beyond that, I point out we have mutual defense treaty commitments with our critical allies, South Korea and Japan. We also have history. In the case of the Republic of Korea, it's the shared blood that we shed together during the Korean War. In the case of Japan, it's the history that we overcame in the last century, being military opponents, to now being allies and partners and friends. We've also had countless presidential statements of commitment and resolve. We've had comments by the senior military leadership of the U.S. But most importantly, we've deployed the most important resource of America, is the sons and daughters in uniform. We have tens of thousands of them here in Japan and in the Republic of Korea. They're standing shoulder to shoulder with you in harm's way. It's been said that people sleep peaceably in their beds at night only because rough men stand ready to do violence on their behalf. And I always wonder, where do we find the brave men and women who are brave enough and unselfish enough to stand on the ramparts of freedom on our behalf, and yet they do. So they do not make that commitment lightly. Also, the parents of those brave men and women, and I am the father of a United States Marine. Every day he was in Afghanistan, my wife and I were very nervous, but he went. And every parent and spouse and child of all the men and women who are here in Japan and in Korea, they're nervous, but they support their loved ones who are there and here doing the right thing. So, the men and women in uniform do not make that commitment lightly. The parents don't make that commitment lightly, but we will be there for you. And if you don't trust that commitment, then the presence of a few tactical nuclear weapons won't do it. And if you don't trust that commitment, then we have trouble in our alliance. So thank you for that.
Nishi-san, please. This is very simple, but I have been involved in the security-related work for 35 years, and for 35 years I have been involved in security-related work. In a way, I am a very optimist. That means that when it comes to the U.S. commitment, when we think about it, let's say the U.S. fails in achieving the commitment, then there's going to be a serious repercussion that hits the United States. People say that country does not keep the promise, that dishonor would visit the U.S. On the flip side is the U.S. presidents, say a U.S. president, when this person issues a commitment, he's very careful. Once it's issued, there's no doubt about this. So I myself, keeping the U.S. commitment, I have no doubt. The issue is how can we support the United States for keeping the promise. Around this issue, how should the two countries cooperate to lessen the burden on the part of the U.S.? That is the crux of the matter. The other point is, I may sound rather malicious, but for China, should we cooperate? There may be situations where we think so. This may be a bad way to put it, but for China, how nasty can Japan be? If you want to see such a Japan, maybe China would like to cooperate with this or that. This is often mentioned, but they want Japan not to go nuclear. Rather, maybe China wants to be involved with North. That's one good example. But how, on our part, how much should we make an effort? To put it in extremely terms, how should we dirty our hands so that the international community understand the gravity of this issue? For example, if we use, I think there is a lot of wisdom that we can exert here in Japan. At any rate, what Mr. Klingner said, and also for a long time, I have been working for a long time, and the U.S. commitment is something that I do not really doubt. If I have any such time to do that, then more effectively, and the burden on the part of the U.S. should be lessened as an ally. I think it would be more productive to think about that for the management of this relationship. Well, the Professor Terhami with University of Maryland, well, we have been having discussion. You have done a poll and you're looking at the public sentiment. Now, to you, how does this kind of a conversation look to you?
Well, I can obviously address mostly the American public opinion of this.
Microphone, please.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. So obviously, it's my focus on is on American public opinion. I think what I have witnessed in over the years, particularly with other crises, is that the measures that we see when they're hypothetical, such as now, when you ask them, would you consider using military force, really changes dramatically when there is a crisis and they have to decide. So public opinion is fluid. Part of it is what happens on the ground and when they have to make a real decision about whether to go to war or not. And part of it has to do with how our leaders frame the questions. We've seen that, obviously, public opinion changes. We've seen that in the past, even on something relatively simple, like whether or not to intervene to strike Syria after President Obama found that Assad used chemical weapons. American public really was very reluctant to intervene, even though it would have been relatively easy for the U.S. to have intervened when the decision was made because of the misgivings about American military intervention out of the Iraq War. Now, the Korean issue specifically, I have to tell you that right now, when I'm looking at American public opinion, I'm trying to sort out how much of it is a real assessment of the issue itself, where Americans are thinking, here are the pluses and here are the minuses, and how much of it is just knee-jerk reaction. I am with President Trump and I'm against President Trump. And right now, on issues where there are no concrete actions before the United States, where the public really isn't making a decision, should we now send troops or not? Should we now intervene or not? Should we now go to war or not? It's all hypothetical. Very often, what we're finding in public opinion is not a true reflection of where the public is on issues. That what we call in America, this is more about identity politics. We see that on multiple issues related to foreign policy in general, where it isn't, there's nothing that happened on the ground to change the public's assessment. So what does that lead us? Where does that, lead us? Number one, I think leaders' communications to the public are really central. So clarity of message about what is before them is really important. For example, I do think that most of the rise of importance in the Korean issue in the American public discourse is a function of our government raising that issue rather than the testing itself of North Korea. It's just we made the decision to increase that. So I think that it's really very fluid, and we have to be careful in terms of how we interpret public opinion.
Thank you very much. So next, President Trump will visit ROK, China, and Japan. And his activity from the perspective of resolution of the North issues, what can we expect, what we cannot expect? Well, I'd like to ask this question to some of you. What? Right. So, Mark Lippert, about ROK. Well, when you go to ROK, and what do you expect from President Trump and Mr. Paul, China and Japan? What do you expect from President Trump with respect to Japan and China, from each of you?
He goes to Korea first.
All right, I'll take on the question of what does Trump do in China. The administration has, in a variety of briefings, private and public, indicated that the two main themes of President Trump's visit to China will be how to increase pressure on North Korea, which we've been discussing now for quite a long time. And the second is trade. The Secretary of Commerce, Ross, will take a separate aircraft with some 40 CEOs who will go to try to come back with deals. Among them are a lot of people involved in the energy field. Now that the United States is the leading hydrocarbon exporter in the world, and we have a lot of excess natural gas to market, I think and China is trying to transition from coal to gas in its energy production. There should be some meeting of the minds. There's also going to be efforts to penetrate new markets in China. American financial services are underrepresented. China has industries that are dominated by 4 very large banks and have in the past not been very competitive. I'm afraid, from what I know of the American approach on this subject of opening new markets in China, that focusing on the financial services market is a little out of step with reality in China. We're trying to get the credit card businesses to be accepted in China. My own personal experience, China is moving past credit cards very rapidly. I would much prefer an emphasis on financial technology, so-called fintech, to include the use of cell phones to pay bills, which is prevalent throughout China today. We're a little out of tune, a little bit backward. Similarly, there's a concern about the automobile market in China. The United States, Japan, and Germany export something like 8 million cars a year to China. Most of these are Japanese and German trademarks made in the United States and exported to China. And there's a concern that the American trademarks, Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors, are not getting enough share. I think this is sort of a 1980s look at the market in China. And I'm concerned because China is very rapidly introducing new technology rules for electric-driven engines and for autonomous driving, and that we really ought to be focusing our energies as a country, and with our colleagues in Japan and Germany who are exporters there, to look at influencing the standards that are chosen so we don't wake up in 3 years and find that we've been frozen out of the Chinese market by manipulation of the automobile standards there. And then finally, there's an agenda to reduce the export of products to the United States that are coming from the oversupply of capacity in China in steel and aluminum. And here I think China will readily agree to voluntary restraints on these industries' exports to the United States, because China can easily afford to do it, can do it through third countries in any event. So China is in a strong position. I guess my final observation will be, whatever the U.S. asks for in this coming visit, China can be extremely accommodating. I have never seen China more self-confident that it can find a way to work around what we ask for and appear to meet our requirements, in some cases actually meeting those requirements, and in other cases persuading us that they've met them without actually doing so. So I think this is likely to be a trip that underachieves on the both the foreign policy and the commercial side.
On the president's trip to Korea, what I would say that the themes, in some ways, I think are going to be similar. If you look back at if you look really at the foundation of the U.S.-ROK alliance, it's built on really two core agreements. One is the Mutual Defense Treaty, and the second is the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Act. Right? One obviously is deeper and more ingrained. Second is relatively new. I think on the security side, I think there'll be just two main points. One, I think you'll want to show solidarity with U.S. and ROK troops, and obviously support U.S. troops that are overseas deployed there. But second, I think the more pressing question, at least in the minds of the opinion makers and I think the government in South Korea, is getting alignment on North Korea policy. I do think policy is generally pretty well aligned, but I do think some of the statements of the president himself have caused ambiguity. As I said earlier, I think Secretary Mattis' trip there over the weekend has been designed around two, what we call the MCM and the SCM. These are the military consultative mechanism, the security consultative mechanism. These are annual meetings of our top uniform and then our two defense ministers, essentially back to back over the weekend. I think that was designed to help clarify where the policy is headed, and I think you saw Secretary Mattis really emphasize diplomacy in his public statements there. But again, I don't think it's enough, unless and until the Korean government and the Korean opinion leaders and the Korean people hear it from the president himself. And I think there's I would say a high degree of interest on that. The second, on the trade front, on KORUS, the reports in Washington is that this agreement has been hanging literally by a thread in many instances, and the administration has been close to either pulling out and or asking for a number of things to be accelerated or basically agreed to with almost out reciprocation on the Korean side. And you've seen, for example, strong statements of opposition to the Trump administration from the U.S. Korea Business Council, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. There is concern among the business community on that agreement. Taking just a quick step back on the agreement itself, the big areas where there are sort of irritations are centered generally around automobiles is the big one, but where there really is a lot of I guess you'd say irritation from the U.S. business community is around things that are generally in sectors that were supposed to be unlocked by KORUS, but technically fall outside the agreement. And you get a lot of complaints and a concern about regulations that don't meet international standards, a lot of complaints and concerns about taxes, customs, things like that. So I actually have always felt that there's kind of a win-win here, that you go in, you make some adjustments to the treaty or implement it in a more effective way, but then you get to the meat of the matter, which is this area outside. Let me close by saying, before I get the bell, is that I would also just like to see a little more offense around some of these global issues that have been a centerpiece of the U.S.-Korean relation. Our work on nonproliferation together, our work on environment together, our work on human rights together. We've taken the alliance away from the peninsula and broadened it to a global alliance, and I'd like to see a little bit more work on that. Cyberspace, energy, things like that truly really make this a global alliance and a force multiplier, not just on the peninsula, not just Asia, but around the world. I'll stop there.
So Kudo-san asked me to just comment briefly on Trump's visit to Japan, and I think Japan, in a way, has the benefit of this being a relatively low-key part of the visit, of the trip for Trump. It's not a state visit. He's not going to give a big speech like he will in Korea or in Vietnam. I don't expect any new ground to be broken here, and it comes at the very beginning of his trip. So I think Trump will be energized and fresh and happy to see his old friend Shinzo Abe and play a little bit of golf if the weather holds up. Clearly, North Korea will be the public face of this visit and the alliance, solidarity, the policy of pressure. I think this ties into an effort to continue to ask or seek Japan's activism on diplomacy. Japan has been very active whenever Kono Gaimu Daijin is in Middle East or in Southeast Asia. He's pressing countries to limit money going to North Korea and such. And so I think Trump sees Japan as an ally in that policy. The theme of this whole trip appears to be this idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific. We hear that as the mantra of this trip. And that in many ways was a theme that was borrowed from the Abe administration, actually going back to 2006 with the Arc of Freedom and Prosperity, the Diamond, U.S., India, Japan, Australia cooperation, kind of cementing the foundation of a rules-based order in the region. So that will be a key theme. Capacity building, aid coordination, and Japanese defense contributions to regional stability. The big question is how much on the trade front will Trump press? Trump would like to have a bilateral negotiation called a free trade agreement, but basically it's a market opening way of pressing to try to get more concessions from Japan on certain trade issues. I think Abe will play defense on that front, and hopefully, from my perspective, that will be a relatively small part of this trip. You can just never predict what we'll get into Trump's priority list and when he has a chance to say something. But I expect the emphasis to be on the other areas.
Thank you very much. It is 4:20. We are going to collect questionnaires from the audience, so please hand them to our staff members. I would like to go closer to the very core of our discussion. I would like to ask questions to Mr. Powell, Douglas Powell, and to Ambassador Miyamoto. Giving pressure to North Korea is not for the sake of pressurizing them. We would like to obtain something through the means of pressure on North Korea, such as nuclear giving up their nuclear weapons, or making them come back to the table of negotiations. So, considering those goals of pressures, how should we pressurize North Korea, and how should we involve China in doing so? That's the question I would like to ask. Jintao earlier said that they are very good to be suffering, so the pressure is cannot be really effective readily. So that's the question I would like to elaborate on, and I'd like to ask that to Douglas Powell. But before that, Ambassador Miyamoto, doing a diplomatic policy and contacts, but we have to make North Korea give up their nuclear weapons. I would like for Ambassador Miyamoto to elaborate on that point. But first, that question I mentioned goes first to Douglas Powell. How do we pressurize? How should we pressurize North Korea to get our goal?
Well, I think it may have come across that I'm not very optimistic that sanctions by themselves will take care of this nuclear question for us. The first rule in medicine, and I think in this policy area as well, is first do no harm. And the fact that North Korea had been able to trade within China in areas that earned hard currency that they could use to purchase things, and then trade in areas that were less directed at hard currency, but able to gave them the ability to acquire key technologies or things that supported key technologies that made the weapon systems possible. We want to cut that off. And I'll give you an example. There's a American research team did very complex studies and discovered that there was a lot of mercury, the liquid metal mercury, being sold to China. This was not on any prohibition list. It was not seen as a special problem, being sold by China to North Korea. It turns out that this is really an important ingredient in manufacturing solid rocket fuel. Nobody was selling solid rocket fuel to North Korea, but without the mercury, they could not make it themselves. So it was important to identify that and get it on the list of items that should not be traded with entities that deal with North Korea. There were also, there's a quality to the North Korean transactions within China and around the world, kind of a shape shifter quality where a Korean firm would have a name one day and another name the next day, and the parties in China or elsewhere, Malaysia, other places where North Koreans have been active, could do transactions and claim to be legitimately unaware that it was still a North Korean firm. A lot of progress has been made to shut this down. I'll give you an example. The Western banks like UBS and JP Morgan and others have in recent years been through very tough times because they were found to be, in effect, laundering money for criminal syndicates because they did not know their customers. KYC, know your customer, is a very important rule. It wasn't easy for these banks to learn that. The Chinese themselves at the top levels of their banking system thought they had issued adequate guidance to their commercial banks not to do business with North Korean businesses. Very effective bureaucrats in the United States Treasury Department produced very large computer printouts of precisely the kinds of transactions that the Chinese themselves were missing and they were permitting to take place. And in exchange for not being prosecuted for past misdeeds, the Chinese came forward in August and September and said they now have a KYC, a Know Your Customer policy in place. And we'll test it over time to see if they're doing the right thing, but they do seem to be preventing the North Koreans from shifting the names of their companies and evading effective sanctions. But as I said at the outset, I don't believe these sanctions will by themselves be enough to solve the problem for us, but they may prevent the problem from getting worse.
So if I had an answer to answer a question to Kudo-san from Kudo-san, then international committee would be much more quickly resolved this whole question, I think. So that's the extent to which this question is so difficult. But it's been for a long time that the UN cannot be able to effectively deal with this issue. We cannot let this situation, we have to do something about it. That it's really a never-ending game. It has been the case. When we take some actions, North Korea did worse or cope with that. But we have to enhance it. That's the only option that we have.
Because without that, sanction will have no value whatsoever. Why are we doing to begin with? And that will create a world where the international society accept that. But we need to not accept that. Right? But to do so, how can we have a more effective international collaboration? It's a very difficult but rudimentary question. We have to go back to that, right? But at the same time, the violation of the sanctions. Who's the best to identify the violation of the sanctions by North Korea is Americans, right? Comes to the United Nations. Almost all the violations were reported and submitted by Americans, if not everything. UN Resolution Committee doesn't have its own power to do that kind of research. So we, like a CIA, should deserve to have more budget so that they can track all those violations by North Korea, I hope. But at the same time, the remaining things that have not been implemented are relatively small. Not each single one of them can bring solution to this problem. But if we have one after another to make it bigger in total and work collaboratively with international society, I think that's the only way. There's no easy answer. If we do, this problem is being gone many years ago. As Paul-san said, and I agree with him, China does not have everything under control in China. That's also another problem of China. But situation might be slightly different. President Trump is making here and there a phone call to Xi Jinping, which is, I think, I take it positively. Because I experienced myself when the poisoned dumpling was found, right? But then if the leadership get message and the leadership cascade the messages, and then the people in the rank and file, the fields act. Fields may not know everything. Fields or the rank and file didn't do everything perfectly. But leadership, phone calls be made. Every time he gets phone call, Mr. Xi Jinping have to, I bet, ask questions. And that questions has to be answered from what's happening in the field. And American intelligence can check what's in the field if the Xi Jinping's commitment didn't get delivered. And then the president make another phone call pointing out, no, they are not doing the job. Now he is the integrated big leader in China. And if the American counterpart is pointing that out, that is one of the biggest way to lose face. And of course, we shouldn't expect miracle. I would say that in the stop. Now, looking at those list of questions, Koda-san, I just have to ask you this. What's happening in North Korea? What are they doing today? Because they are relatively rather quiet nowadays. Aren't they anxious and planning something for next big thing? Bruce probably is a better person, knows much better about that. But there are two ways to look at it, I guess. One is very, how would I say this? It's a sarcastic sort of Kim Jong-un. He might, because Mr. Trump is so outrageous, taken by him to surprise. Now, this is not what I heard. Because traditionally, before August 10th of this year, August 10th is the day when North Koreans very proudly shoot missile with Hwangjae-12, 4 of them, right? And that is the time when Mr. Trump reacted with fire and fury. After the Funson 412 and after the hydrogen bomb on September, or the United Nations speech that Mr. Trump made was very aggressive talks, because Kim Jong-un traditionally, before those points, they were so frightened about our experiments of missiles. But at least that's what his people has been reporting. But now Mr. Trump comes with tweets which a lot of people do not like. But there are people who can tweet in North Korea, right? So if you are given that authority. And those people look at Mr. Trump's tweet, and they are the... Now, Americans are not frightened. They are not shaken up or being scared. No, Mr. Trump is upset. He's about to lift his fist and punch us. Now, this is not so high level, because I'm not talking in random, because there are some signs, right? One is after August 10th, after the fire and fury, the North said decided to not launch Hwasong because they wanted to see the reaction of the U.S. because that was the first time that they knew that the risk comes with shooting close to the territory of the U.S. And then September 12th, they shot the missile over Hwasong 12 over the land of Japan, and they changed the top narrative, right? Not to the U.S. because that was the date shot on the day that Japan have colonized the Korean Peninsula. So that there's a change of the shift of narrative. So what happened to the Guam discussions that they have? They probably have a virtual Guam still in their head, 35,000 miles away. But that narrative is completely shifted, targeting to Japan. And Hwasong 14 with ICBM reaching America is the next round of the test that they want to desperately experiment. But after the September 11th fury by Mr. Trump and Mr. Tillerson and Mr. Tillerson, Mr. Mattis being used as a negotiation. The other one was the last one, or maybe it's silence before the storm. But to demonstrate the power to the U.S., ICBM or Hwasong 14 have to be launched, right, for them to demonstrate it. Well, there was some argument about it, but they are not going to be used forces, military forces, armies, right? Nobody knows if it will work. But so they have to prove that they can fly easily to 10,000 kilometers with accuracy, right? And you ask me question, what's happening in North Korea? What are they doing? North Korea, I think they were started to be intimidated in America for the first time because they know what they are in it. The U.S. So rather than small puppy scaring off of Alaskan huge bear, it was the opposite. They were the huge bear. We're the puppy. So what they were doing is they go to take a young sister to cosmetic factory or can factory. Now, it's not, there is no ground fictitious schemes. They are trying to make up some time before they can come out with a new strategy. I don't think they will step back, but he first knew that they were in a big potential risk. They are the more dangerous people than we thought we are. So they will come with a new strategy, but it's been 2 months since August 10th, and looking at many different indications that could. I don't think I am perfectly right about this assumption, but this silence that we're seeing might be the sign of the first time that North is being now scared and shaken up by what America could do. Is that right interpretation that I should be? Well, I have. There were many different questions that we have received from the room. Now, every questions that I received so far is directed to Americans. Okay, so I'll ask questions to you guys. Now, North Korean problem. Mr. Trump says they can take care by himself or themselves. If that's right, what can we do specifically when he come visit our region? Specifically, I mean, with the specific example, what are the things that he will do to solve that problem? What are the things that we can suggest or work with together? And another thing is mid to long-term Japan-US alliance. What is the expectation from America? We got so ambiguous ever since the shift to the Trump administration. But what would be the midterm, long-term expectation that you have from America about the bilateral relationship? And the questions to James Soffs. President Trump, for Trump, maybe security is a card that he wants to use so that he can make a better deal out of Japan. Is that possible that he'll be making deal with us in that way? And solving North Korean, how to engage China more for North Korean problem? Or is it necessary to engage them? And how to do so? So now we have a list of questions to American friends about North Korean problem. If Mr. Trump is serious about solving it, what are the things? I'd like everybody from the Americas to speak about that, what he will be doing. And we have additional questions that I just shared. How should I go with this one? Jim Schaff, would you want to go?
Since I have one specific question for me, and I may touch on one other. But in terms of Trump kind of using security as a form of pressure or trying to get a better deal from Japan, let me start by saying the two most obvious convictions that President Trump has with regard to Japan stem from the 1980s, really, and the 1990s in the context of his conviction that Japan is still not a true fair trade, that trade between our two countries is still not completely fair and free, and that Japan takes advantage of the United States. I think he continues to believe that's the case. And he also believes that even though his Secretary of Defense and many other people tell him that Japan is a model of host nation support and support for U.S. forces here, personally, I think he still believes that the U.S. is giving Japan more than we are getting back in terms of not only host nation support, but also Japan's contributions to security and in other ways. I totally disagree with both of those convictions. I think he's wrong, and there's various ways to demonstrate that. But I think it's those convictions that will continue to kind of pop up in some of these meetings. So overall, I'm encouraged by the fact that his personal convictions are really not shared by anyone else in his administration, besides maybe Commerce Secretary Ross a little bit on the trade front and USTR Lighthizer. But overall, there is no bottom-up demand from American business community or from American people or from within his administration to fundamentally fix the U.S.-Japan relationship. So, and Abe has so many ways of describing the contributions that Japan is making and ways of demonstrating value to U.S. interests in terms of dealing with refugee crisis in Europe and the Middle East and helping vis-a-vis North Korea and in other ways. So I'm not as worried about. I don't think that pressure or trying to get some kind of better deal from Japan will really become an issue in the relationship. And also, Abe has the ability to be the first person that Trump meets before this trip. So he will whisper into Trump's ear regarding things to say in Seoul and things to be on the lookout for in China. So that's another advantage that Abe has on this trip. Thank you.
I think it's really important in Trump's visit to China that he convey to the Chinese leadership that the United States is going to do what is necessary to protect ourselves and our allies from the emerging threat capabilities in North Korea. Now, China doesn't like some of the things we've already done, such as the deployment of THAAD with radars that many Chinese believe can read the Chinese own military strategic capabilities, and that therefore will diminish the effectiveness of Chinese strategic forces over time as we use those radars to observe Chinese experimental launches and re-entries by space vehicles. Well, if China doesn't like that, we can talk about it. We've offered to brief them on the THAAD capabilities in the past, and I believe even if China would take that up, they might discover there are some options that would be less or more unfavorable to China. The goal would be to convince the Chinese that this is not something they can continue to be an ostrich about and hide their heads in the sand and just be negative. That has already cost them public support among the people of South Korea, and it's not brought them any closer to managing the North Korean threat. And if you can get to that point, then you can start talking about what I mentioned about halfway through this program, which is how do we find ways of mutual reassurance about our interests. This will never be an easy conversation. This engages very profound stakes. On the other hand, letting this North Korean problem freewheel between our two countries in a world when we are more equally, we're not equal yet, but we're more and more equally disposed against each other militarily, could be very, very dangerous. And we need to get him to understand the danger of that. And moreover, if he understands it, then take advantage of the substantial increase in autonomy and strength that he has as a leader in China to do more. Now, you might ask me as a follow-on question, does Trump really understand this, and do his people understand this? And I have myself rather serious doubts. We may have the wrong people at the wrong time, or excuse me, the wrong people at the right time to deal with this problem.
I thought I'd go back to the earlier point of when will North Korea do another provocation and why or why not. My prediction is that they'll do a nuclear missile test on November 11th. And the reason for that is there are many theories. Some is that North Korea does it on holidays, either U.S. or North Korean, and they've done it on the 4th of July and others, and they recently North Korea even said that it was a gift to President Trump on the anniversary of America's independence. Other ideas are that it's on official anniversaries. So we've heard that it was on, one of them was announced as the anniversary of the Japanese annexation. I talked to a North Korean official and asked, sort of how do we figure out these events? And he said, well, of course, the December 2012 missile launch was on a very important anniversary. I couldn't remember what it was. And he said, well, that's the anniversary of in 1946 when the first indigenously produced North Korean rifle after the end of the Japanese occupation was produced and handed to Kim Il-sung. And just as the North Korean rifle would protect the nation, the North Korean missile would protect the nation. But really, I think the real reason or the factor is what's most inconvenient for me. Because it seems every time North Korea does something, it's during either a business trip, one of my vacations, or a major event like an anniversary. Right, and so November 11th is my wife's birthday. We have reservations at a fancy, expensive French restaurant. So it would be most inconvenient for me to have to cancel that. So I think that's why they do it. But anyway, but more seriously is we struggle with, when they do it, is it a message? And I think a lot of times it's just the scientists will go to the leadership and say, okay, we're ready for another nuclear test, another missile test. You figure out when you want to do it, but we need to do another one to either figure out whether it's going to work or not, or to let the Americans know that we have this capability. But also there will be times when they don't do something and we wonder why they didn't do it. And it was like, well, with the October 10th, it was everyone thought they were going to do it, and they didn't. And then rather than just thinking, well, maybe that they just weren't thinking of doing it that day, even though many media and experts predicted it. But then we often run into like, why didn't they do it on the day we predicted? Was it because of Chinese pressure? Was it because of the sanctions, or was it because of something else? And we end up in this this endless cycle of analysis and over-analysis. So. And if they're doing it as a message, a lot of times we don't know what the message is. So I think back on one story before I get the bell, is a coworker of mine at work got divorced. And during the divorce proceedings, it came out that his wife had been sending him a signal of her, displeasure with things he was doing. He didn't know. It turns out she knew he liked his cup of coffee in the morning while he read the paper, and he had sugar in his coffee. So to show, to make things miserable for him and to show how angry she was, she'd move the sugar bowl away from the customary place. Well, he didn't think anything about it. It was just, he has to go get the sugar bowl. And it wasn't until the divorce that he found out this was all these signals that she was angry with him and was eventually going to get a divorce if only he'd understood that signal. In a way, I think sometimes the North Korean signals are as subtle as if they're sending a signal, we don't know what it is. And then, therefore, we can't interpret it correctly. So, thank you.
Mark, you had a quick...
Yeah, just a really quick follow-up is, I do think that sometimes we struggle, and I would say this even in the Obama administration we did, to recognize that there's a shift between Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un, right? And I think part and parcel of what Bruce is getting at on the analysis of when tests and what could be divined from certain tests is a little bit of a lag in terms of we're still in this mindset that there's a lot of political messaging around this program. There is some, but I do think that it's inescapable. One inescapable conclusion is Kim Jong-un has turned this into a much more of a military program. This is now a program that is designed less to send political signals and much more to provide an end state by which there is a discernible military capability aimed at carrying out military means. And I think to that end, they still need tests to up the efficacy of this military program. And so to Bruce's point, just to augment it, is that it's much less political, and I'm sure there are times that there still are political messages sent, but much more military in capability and much more military intent. And I think that's the lens which we have to look through it.
Mark, just a quick question. Wouldn't you agree, though, that to an extraordinary degree, Kim Jong-un has identified himself with these weapons programs by witnessing the takeoffs, walking around the model bombs, visiting every factory, rewarding the scientists concerned. He's really upped the ante as a domestic political objective of his own as well.
No, very fair. And my point is more that this isn't what his father's program was, which is a small number of weapons aimed at regime survival and then used for political negotiations. This is much more of a program that is now taken on a military component to it. And I think to your point, you're absolutely right. He has upped the ante domestically. And you look also, if you do sort of the criminology of North Korea, he's starting to surround himself more with these rocket scientists as well. So there's that too.
We'll go Jenny and then...
Yeah, I would agree with what Bruce was saying, and I find that too. A lot of these tests do fall also on my vacation schedule, and when I have plans to be out of the office for too long. And I do think we do have a tendency now to overanalyze when North Korea does something and when North Korea doesn't do something, and I would also caution against reading too much of a political message in North Korea not doing something right now, because there is much more of a technical component now of their testing regime. And I would assume that part of the reason why we haven't seen a test, knowing that another ICBM test is coming, they do have to still do an ICBM test at range to prove this technology and demonstrate this capability. And I would assume that part of the pause now might be more technical than it is political, given the fact that we know that he wants to do it. I would also, just to go back to President Trump's visit to Seoul coming up, and I do think it's going to be, and this whole discussion of, what is the U.S. actually willing or ready or able to do unilaterally. And I think it's very important that Trump has very careful and consistent and clear messaging when he's in Seoul, and that messaging matches what Mattis has been saying this weekend, because part of the problem has been this really the differences in what's coming from the president and his tweets and his rhetoric versus what the State Department and what the Defense Department have followed up with and tried to reassure South Korea, especially of the strength of the alliance. And while, yes, the commitment to the alliance is strong right now, I think there is a very real growing fear that the U.S. is willing to act unilaterally and especially militarily. And that is a rising question, and that's something that there's a growing sentiment in South Korea that Trump is really making this problem worse by even hinting at it, and that it's really escalating the situation that doesn't need to necessarily be as urgent as it is. So I know one of the things we're watching very closely as well is Trump's speech to the National Assembly and questioning who's going to write that speech and will he stay on message. And I hope he does, and I hope that that message does become, is reassuring in that process. And I do think there is a little bit of, even in Washington, I think we're always a little bit confused as to who's really has the authority and who really has the president's ear when it comes to a lot of foreign policy issues, because you do hear different messages coming from the president, from National Security Council, and then oftentimes is very different from, or at least different enough from what the State Department and Defense Department are saying, that it does raise a lot of questions as to what is really our policy and what is our path forward. And if it's confusing for us in Washington, I can only imagine how confusing it is also and worrisome it is in among our allies as well.
It was suggested that perhaps the president or the people who surround him do not fully grasp some of the issues that we're talking about, and that's probably true. There is an interpretation, though, of American foreign policy, including by one of my colleagues at Brookings, that if you ignore the noise for a moment that comes out of the presidency and the White House, there hasn't been a profound change in the American institutional approach to foreign policy issues. And the Pentagon goes about doing its business, and so does the CIA, and so does the Department of State. And in some ways, a lot of people around the world deal with daily business as usual, and all of the rest you can look at as more or less as noise. I don't necessarily buy into it. I think there's a lot of continuity in American foreign policy despite that. But where there is definitely a dramatic change is the president's ability to change the story every day. And that has been far more rapid than we have seen in any presidency. And in that regard, I think it's not just changing the story, it's really with it changing the public perception of the priorities facing American foreign policy. And Jenny is worried perhaps that the increased attention on the North Korea issue is in fact created or constructed in a manner that is not necessarily conducive to America's national interest, or certainly doesn't reflect the real priority issues if you look at it objectively. Perhaps, and maybe therefore one can hope that it'll change. I worry about that we don't actually stick with anything that we choose. So now it's a priority, and we've mobilized certain resources to go with it, and tomorrow something else will be a priority. And it's likely to be because obviously we all have many theories about how the president personally chooses his priorities. Perhaps even there is a strategy of distracting from one issue to move to the other issue, whether it's for political reasons or for other reasons. Sometimes it's credibility. It was suggested perhaps that at some point, because he said, I'm going to resolve this issue, that is the North Korean issue, that at some point he's going to be under pressure to in fact deal with it one way or the other, so he can't live with failure. Well, we've seen him actually live with failure by just go into another issue. Instead of just having to carry through or pay a political price, he will shift that tension. So that actually worries me more, because then the public isn't having a sustained understanding of an issue. And it worries me more because of the signals that it sends to partners across the globe, much more than the actual implementation of American foreign policy.
Well, thank you very much. I think we have received a lot of questions to the Japanese side as well, but I would like one answer to be, one question to be answered very briefly. Well, this has to do with Mr. Tokuchi and Mr. Miyamoto. To contain North Korea, after recognizing North as a nuclear state and contain it, how can it happen? How do you contain North? Well, Miyamoto-san, in this case, in order to strengthen the Japan's nuclear deterrence, the nuclear-related possession or the introduction, all these included. Are people already considering this possibility? This was one question, and could you answer this question? As we fear the weight of this issue, before asking Mr. Schoff to summarize this whole meeting. Mr. Miyamoto and Mr. Tokuchi. Well, thank you very much for the question. Accepting North as a nuclear state, that's not a possible option that we can take. Why are we discussing North issue? Because we don't want to see an increasing number of nuclear states, be it ROK, Japan. If there's an increase in the number of nuclear states, well, in this respect, that can't be possible. And also, there would be a development of a proliferation. We didn't want to accept that. And so, well, this is quite contrary to having North give up the nuclear program.
Having said that, currently, trying to resolve this issue in a short term, quickly, is impossible as well, in my view. Therefore, we have to be prepared to address it in a long term. I think Kudo-san will scold me if I say the following. We shouldn't try to avoid U.S. military actions. I don't think that the military actions per se is good, but we should be just ready to see U.S. military actions being executed. And U.S. as well as the U.S. allies need to clearly show that an attitude to North Korea, and we also have to do a specific planning for that. China, if China is worried about the possible inflow of refugees, counter contingency plans for that is also necessary. But at the same time, when the U.S. takes an actual military action, South Korea and Japan will have to support it, and we also have to do the specific planning, including how Japan and South Korea, U.S. allies, will support the U.S. military actions. And based on the planning, we should do the prior deployment, increase the presence, and do the exercise, joint exercises. We have to do those visible activities so that Japan, South Korea, and the international community as a whole show the readiness and the determination. That attitude needs to be clearly shown to North Korea. And also currently, U.S. and North Korea are doing somewhat childish verbal battles, but it's not actually the whole picture. We should understand that this is really North Korea versus the international community. James Schock talked about a rule-based order in his initial presentation. U.S. also needs to show that they are rule-based and they are on the side of respecting the order. Well, these days, the record was updated, so it is already publicly known. Japanese government for a certain period of time seriously considered the possibility of holding a nuclear weapons, but eventually decided that it was a wrong option for Japan, so gave up that particular option of having a nuclear weapons. And then ever since then, Japanese government stick to that policy of not having nuclear weapons. Then the logic saying that North Korea becomes a nuclear state, so why don't Japan becomes a nuclear state as well? That means that there is a distrust on the part of Japan of a nuclear umbrella of the United States. Because there is a lack of trust to a U.S. Nuclear umbrella, the logic would say that why don't Japan become a nuclear state? But the premise is that the U.S. Nuclear umbrella is solid enough. That's judged by the experts. So expanded deterrence by U.S. and the U.S. umbrella of nuclear power, we should entrust ourselves continuously to them. Of course, I don't hope that North Korea becomes a nuclear state, properly speaking, but should it happen, I think Japan should entrust itself to those two that I've now just mentioned, because there are so many potential nuclear states across the world. So if we deal with each of those possibilities and have a nuclear state candidate this way by holding a nuclear weapons, then that would collapse the whole order. And control of nuclear weapons will be really an issue, because once one piece of nuclear weapon goes into the hands of a terrorist, and the terrorists can use it to threat the whole piece of the world as a whole. So we really have to stick to the non-proliferation, so that the nuclear weapons will not circulate, will not go in hands of the terrorists. And this is a regime which is being held currently by the international community, but that would be possibly hampered if we react that way. So I really think that Japan should never try to have a nuclear weapons. Well, thank you very, very much. We had about a 3-hour discussion. James Choff, it is now for you to wrap up, please.
Kudo-san, I want to thank you for bringing us together with such a great group of scholars and many, especially on the Japanese side, that I respect so much, and on the U.S. side as well, and some that I've worked with, and for convening this event today. You have been a most patient and durable audience for this long discussion. A discussion that is difficult to summarize, and I won't necessarily try. That a discussion that does not necessarily point us closer to any particular solution to this problem, but I think still has value nonetheless. And for me, what I've learned both on Friday's discussion and today is truly the value of something that Ambassador Miyamoto was talking about as well. The importance of unity, of regional unity, and of regional dialogue, because we have a paradox to some extent. On the one hand, this is a most urgent problem, and we talk about that time is not on our side, or that we're running out of time. Time is running out. The window is closing. And there are elements of truth to that. But at the same time, we do have to keep it in perspective, and that's another point that has been echoed today, that we have tools at our disposal, that it's not such an immediate crisis that we have to rush into some kind of solution that's not well thought out. And ultimately, in my mind, what could potentially give us more time to deal with this situation, because I think we need more time in this regard, is regional cooperation, is the region-wide approach. And the region-wide approach can help make up for the fact that we don't have complete U.S.-China unity on purpose and strategy. As a matter of fact, in various ways, we are working at cross purposes at some levels. I would like to propose and would like to see actually concrete movement toward convening five-party talks. We've talked about different configurations of discussions. In the past, China has always been reluctant to have five-party talks so that they wouldn't be ganging up on North Korea, but the situation has changed such that it may be possible to have a formal forum that allows us to exchange information about what we know about what's going on, to make sure that sanctions are being enforced as well as possible, and to fix holes or gaps when they are observed, to deal with the very important issue of maintaining non-proliferation or counter-proliferation, because that is probably the biggest near-term threat that I see, and it came up in some of our discussions earlier today, that we may be able to deter North Korean nuclear use, but can we deter it from selling a nuclear device to a terrorist organization or elsewhere? And then the fact that we will take measures to defend ourselves as North Korea improves its capabilities, whether it's missile defenses or perhaps Japan developing some kind of counterattack capability. If that is misunderstood or if that creates divisions amongst our countries in the region, and China complains or South Korea complains, all that does is serve the purpose of benefiting North Korea in that regard. So at least building mutual understanding of our various defense measures. Restraint is often a very underappreciated action, because even if in your own deliberations you've thought about 10 things you might do, but you've chosen the least escalatory or the least extreme option, you think you've made a very restrained choice. But still your neighbor, if they don't see that whole deliberation, they still see it as an increase or as an escalation. And so you get these different perspectives that can only be managed by this kind of multilateral dialogue. And that's why I think this framework is so important. So the key issues, clearly the alliances is the core of this regional network. What Japan has done through the 2015 legislation, I think, security legislation, to become a more important partner in security cooperation with the United States and in the region, combined with the trilateral dynamic with South Korea, and then, if we can, move to some kind of five-party discussion, that will send a very powerful signal to North Korea, as has been discussed today, that it's not just the United States that's complaining or Donald Trump that's complaining. This is truly a rejection of North Korean behavior by the entire region and by the world. So I will conclude there and thank you again, Kudo-san, and to your staff and your team that has put this together, and thank my panel colleagues here, and thank you all for sharing your afternoon with us.